The construction sounds begin at exactly 7:30 in the morning, though nothing has been built above Hawk's Nest in over 90 years. Hawk's Nest State Park sits along a dramatic bend in the New River Gorge, where sandstone cliffs rise 800 feet above the water. The park occupies land that was once home to the Hawk's Nest Tunnel Project, a Depression-era construction effort that carved a 3-mile passage through Gauley Mountain between 1930 and 1932. The tunnel was built to divert the New River for hydroelectric power, employing thousands of workers who came from across Appalachia seeking steady wages during the economic collapse. The project site stretched across rugged terrain that had remained largely untouched since Cherokee hunters used the area as a seasonal camp. Geological surveys from the 1920s described the mountain as composed of nearly pure silica sandstone, a formation that created dramatic overlooks but proved deadly during excavation. The rock produced clouds of silica dust when blasted or drilled, dust so fine it hung in the air for hours after work ceased each day. What happened during those 2 years of construction became known as the Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster. Workers, many of them African American migrants from the South, labored in conditions that filled their lungs with silica particles. The company provided no protective equipment and often required shifts lasting 12 to 14 hours. Men began dying within months of starting work, their lungs crystallizing from acute silicosis. Official records list 764 deaths, though local estimates suggest the actual number exceeded 1,000. The tunnel was completed on schedule, but the human cost remained largely hidden from public view until a congressional investigation in 1936 brought national attention to what had occurred. By then, most surviving workers had scattered, and many companies involved had dissolved or changed names. The industrial disaster that claimed more lives than any other workplace incident in American history became a footnote in Depression-era labor struggles. Today, the tunnel still operates as part of the Kanawha River power system, but the construction site above has returned to forest. The overlooks that once housed equipment platforms and worker barracks are now hiking trails and scenic viewpoints within the state park. Nothing remains of the industrial activity that once dominated the area, yet something continues to echo from the empty air above the gorge. The first documented report of phantom construction sounds came from a park ranger named Thomas Whitley in October of 1987. Whitley was conducting a routine trail inspection near the main overlook when he heard what he described as pneumatic drilling coming from directly overhead. He looked up to find clear sky, but the sound continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Whitley noted the incident in his daily log, but dismissed it as aircraft noise or equipment from a distant construction site. Similar reports accumulated over the following years. Hikers described hearing jackhammers, diesel engines, and shouted commands echoing from empty air above various points along the rim trail. The sounds always occurred during daylight hours and seemed to follow a consistent pattern beginning around 7:30 in the morning and continuing intermittently until late afternoon. Multiple witnesses reported hearing the same sequence of drilling, followed by what sounded like blasting charges, then a period of silence before machinery resumed. Dr. Sarah Chen, an acoustic engineer from West Virginia University, first visited Hawk's Nest in October of 1994 after reading about the reports in a regional newspaper. Chen brought professional recording equipment to document what witnesses described, spending 3 days along the rim trail during peak foliage season. On her second morning, she heard distinct drilling sounds coming from approximately 200 feet above the overlook where she stood. The audio signature was consistent with pneumatic rock drills, Chen later wrote in her field notes. The frequency patterns matched industrial equipment from the 1920s or 30s, not modern construction tools. But when I checked my recordings afterward, they contained only ambient forest sounds and my own breathing. Chen returned to Hawk's Nest 4 more times over the next decade, always during October when reports were most frequent. She consistently heard construction sounds that her equipment failed to capture. Other researchers who accompanied her experienced the same phenomenon, clear auditory perception of industrial activity that left no trace on any recording device. Local residents familiar with the area developed their own theories about the phantom sounds. Betty Shrewsbury, whose grandfather died building the tunnel, grew up hearing stories about the construction site. My grandmother used to say the mountain remembered everything that happened to it, Shrewsbury explained in a 1998 interview. She said some places hold on to sounds the way they hold on to water. Park maintenance supervisor Rick Morrison encountered the phenomenon repeatedly during his 15-year tenure at Hawk's Nest. Morrison's responsibilities included inspecting the rim trail and overlook structures, work that often required early morning visits when the phantom construction sounds were most active. You'd hear drilling start up maybe 50 feet over your head, Morrison recalled. It would last maybe 10 or 15 minutes, then stop, then start again, somewhere else along the ridge. Sometimes you'd hear men calling out to each other, but you couldn't make out words. It sounded like they were coordinating work, the way crews do when they're moving equipment or setting charges. Morrison attempted to trace the sounds to their source multiple times, hiking to elevated positions that should have provided a clear view of any construction activity. He never observed anything that could account for what he heard, but noticed that the phantom sounds seemed to follow the exact route of the original tunnel construction, moving from the intake point near Gauley Bridge to the outlet above the New River. The pattern became more apparent as reports accumulated over the years. The sounds began each morning at the western end of the construction site and progressed eastward throughout the day, as if following the tunnel's original excavation schedule. Historical records indicated that crews had worked in exactly this sequence, starting at the river intake and advancing through the mountain in measured daily increments. Dr. Michael Torres, a historian specializing in industrial accidents, spent 2 years researching the Hawk's Nest disaster and its aftermath. Torres discovered that the original construction company had maintained detailed time logs showing when different sections of tunnel were blasted and excavated. The schedule matched the timing witnesses reported for the phantom sounds, down to specific morning start times and afternoon stopping points. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, Torres noted. The sounds people reported followed the exact work schedule from 1931, including breaks for shift changes and equipment maintenance. Torres also uncovered evidence suggesting that the death toll at Hawk's Nest had been systematically underreported. Company records showed discrepancies between payroll numbers and casualty lists, indicating that many workers who died were never officially counted. Local cemetery records revealed unmarked graves dating to the construction period, graves that contained remains showing signs of advanced silicosis. In 1999, the National Park Service conducted a comprehensive acoustic study of Hawk's Nest using equipment sensitive enough to detect subsonic vibrations and electromagnetic anomalies that might explain the reports. The study team spent 6 weeks monitoring the area during October and November, when phantom construction sounds were most frequently reported. Lead researcher Dr. Amanda Foster documented multiple instances of witnesses hearing industrial sounds, while sophisticated recording equipment registered no unusual acoustic activity. Foster's team also measured slight electromagnetic variations that coincided with reported phantom sounds, though the variations fell within normal ranges for the geological composition of the area. We confirmed that people are definitely hearing something, Foster concluded in her final report. The question is whether that something exists in any measurable form outside of human perception. The Park Service study results were filed, but never published, and Foster declined to comment on her findings when contacted by journalists. Her research team was quietly reassigned to other projects, and subsequent requests for acoustic monitoring at Hawk's Nest were denied for budget reasons. Local interest in the phenomenon persisted despite official silence. The Hawk's Nest Historical Society began collecting witness testimonies in 2003, documenting over 40 separate incidents of people hearing phantom construction sounds. The testimonies showed remarkable consistency in describing the timing, location, and apparent progression of the sounds along the original tunnel route. Among the most detailed accounts came from geology professor Dr. James Kellerman, who visited Hawks Nest in October of 2007 to study the silica formations that had made the tunnel construction so deadly. While examining rock samples near the main overlook, Kellerman heard what he described as a complete shift change occurring in empty air above him. First, there was drilling. Then it stopped. Then I heard diesel engines starting up, Kellerman wrote in his field journal. After that came voices, men talking and calling out, but the voices seemed to be getting farther away, as if people were walking down a tunnel. It lasted maybe 20 minutes total, and it was absolutely clear and distinct. But my recorder caught nothing except wind and my own movements. Today, park officials acknowledge that visitors occasionally report unusual sounds along the rim trail, but no formal investigation has been conducted since the aborted 1999 study. The phantom construction sounds continue to occur each autumn, following the same 8-hour schedule they have maintained for over 30 years. Rangers no longer file detailed reports about the incidents, and warning signs posted along the rim trail attribute any unusual sounds to acoustic effects common in gorge environments. The Hawks Nest Tunnel continues operating below ground, generating hydroelectric power as it has for nearly a century, while something above continues to echo the sounds of its deadly construction. Those who hear the phantom drilling and machinery describe the experience as deeply unsettling, not because the sounds seem supernatural, but because they sound so completely, unmistakably real. The work continues in empty air, following a schedule written in stone and silence, above a tunnel that cost more lives than any construction project in American history. The sounds end each day at exactly 4:15 in the afternoon, the same time the original shifts ended in 1931, leaving only wind and the distant roar of water far below in the gorge. The Zimmerman House exists on every official map of Helvetia, West Virginia, but according to the United States government, nobody has ever lived there. Helvetia sits in a remote valley of Randolph County, founded in 1869 by Swiss immigrants seeking familiar mountain terrain in the Appalachian Highlands. The settlement never grew beyond a few dozen families, its isolation preserved by winding gravel roads that discouraged casual visitors and industrial development. The village maintained Swiss architectural traditions and customs well into the 20th century, creating a pocket of alpine culture that felt displaced in time and geography. The community was laid out along a single dirt road that followed Buckhannon River through the narrow valley. Wooden bridges connected farmsteads, scattered across both sides of the water, each property surveyed and recorded in the Randolph County Courthouse when the settlement was established. Original plat maps from 1870 show 13 individual lots, including one marked as belonging to the Zimmerman family on the eastern slope of the valley. The Zimmerman property encompassed 15 acres of pasture land and forest, centered around a 2-story log farmhouse built in the traditional Swiss chalet style. County records indicate the land was purchased in 1869 by Johann Zimmerman, described in the deed as a carpenter from Canton Bern. The property transfer was properly recorded, witnessed, and filed according to territorial regulations that would soon become West Virginia state law. What makes the Zimmerman property unusual is not what was recorded, but what was never counted. Despite continuous habitation for over 150 years, the house has never appeared in any federal census conducted in Helvetia. No residents have ever been enumerated at that address. No demographic data collected, no household composition documented by census takers, who carefully recorded every other family in the isolated community. The absence first came to light in 1993, when genealogist Patricia Kellerman was researching Swiss immigration patterns for her doctoral dissertation at West Virginia University. Kellerman had obtained census records from 1880 through 1990 for Randolph County. intending to trace population changes in ethnic enclaves like Helvetia. While cross-referencing census data with property records, she discovered that one household consistently failed to appear in any enumeration. Every other property in Helvetia was accounted for in every census. Kellerman later wrote in her research notes. Families came and went, properties changed hands, but the census takers were thorough about documenting who lived where, except for this one house. It was like they couldn't see it, or were instructed not to count it. Kellerman drove to Helvetia in the spring of 1994 to examine the property firsthand. She found the Zimmerman house exactly where historical maps indicated it should be. A well-maintained log structure with hand-carved shutters and a slate roof typical of Swiss Alpine architecture. A wooden mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway bore the name Zimmerman in faded painted letters. The current residents, she discovered, were Heinrich and Anna Zimmerman, a couple who appeared to be in their 70s. They spoke English with slight German accents and operated a small dairy farm on the property, selling milk and cheese to neighbors in Helvetia. Heinrich claimed his family had lived on the land since his great-grandfather Johann established the farm in the 1860s. When Kellerman explained her research and asked about census records, Heinrich seemed genuinely puzzled by her questions. "We have always been here," he told her. "My father was here, his father before him. We pay our taxes, we vote in elections. We are Americans like everyone else in the valley." But Kellerman's subsequent investigation revealed no evidence of the Zimmerman family in any official documentation. No birth certificates existed for Heinrich or Anna, no marriage license, no death certificates for previous generations. The family name appeared on no voter registration rolls, no tax assessment records, no Social Security files. According to every database she searched, the Zimmerman family had never existed. Local residents in Helvetia confirmed that the Zimmerman family had been part of the community for as long as anyone could remember. Margaret Sutton, whose family had farmed in the valley since 1920, recalled buying milk from Heinrich's father in the 1950s. Old Gustav Zimmerman, that was Heinrich's father, Sutton said in a 1995 interview, he delivered milk in an old truck every Tuesday and Friday, spoke German half the time, but made the best cheese in the county. Other neighbors provided similar testimonies, stretching back decades. The Zimmerman family had participated in community activities, attended the small Lutheran church that served Helvetia's German-speaking families, and maintained friendly relationships with their neighbors. Yet none of this social integration had left any trace in official records. Dorothy Mueller, who had worked as a mail carrier serving Helvetia from 1967 to 1991, remembered delivering mail to the Zimmerman house throughout her career. "They got catalogs, bills, magazines, same as everybody else," Mueller recalled. "Never had any problem with the address or the name. Post office never questioned it." But when Kellerman contacted the United States Postal Service to verify delivery records, she was told that no mail route had ever included an address for any Zimmerman family in Helvetia. The postal database contained no record of service to that property, despite the presence of the mailbox and Mueller's detailed memories of regular deliveries. The census mystery deepened when Kellerman obtained copies of actual census forms filled out by enumerators who had visited Helvetia in various decades. The forms showed careful documentation of every household in the valley, with detailed notes about property locations and family compositions. Several forms contained margin notes indicating that enumerators had counted houses along the main road, but the tallies always came up one short of the actual structures visible in aerial photographs. Dr. Raymond Fisher, a demographic historian at the National Archives, reviewed Kellerman's findings at her request. Fisher had studied census irregularities across rural Appalachia and was familiar with various factors that might cause households to be missed during enumeration. Census takers sometimes skipped houses that appeared abandoned, or families that were temporarily absent, Fisher explained. But this case is different. We're talking about 15 decades of consistent omission. Fisher noted that census instructions had changed dramatically over the years, with different requirements for documenting household composition, citizenship status, and property ownership. Despite these changes, and despite different individual enumerators conducting the counts, the Zimmerman property had never been included in any official tally. In 1996, Kellerman returned to Helvetia to interview Heinrich and Anna Zimmerman more extensively about their family history. She found the elderly couple still living on the property, but both appeared frailer than they had 2 years earlier. Heinrich's memory seemed less clear, though he insisted his family had always lived on the land his great-grandfather had purchased. Anna showed Kellerman old photographs depicting 4 generations of the Zimmerman family on the property. The images showed the same farmhouse across different time periods, with family members dressed in clothing appropriate to various decades. The photographs appeared authentic, showing natural aging and wear consistent with their supposed dates. But when Kellerman later had the photographs examined by a forensic document specialist, the analysis revealed subtle inconsistencies in the aging patterns and paper composition that suggested they might have been artificially aged. The specialist could not definitively prove the photographs were falsified, but noted several anomalies that would be consistent with deliberate manipulation. Kellerman's investigation attracted attention from the West Virginia State Archives, which began its own inquiry into the census discrepancy. State genealogist Thomas Bradford attempted to trace Zimmerman family records through Swiss immigration databases and Mormon genealogical archives, which maintained extensive records of European emigration to America. Bradford found no record of any Johann Zimmerman emigrating from Canton Bern to West Virginia in the 1860s. Swiss parish records from that period showed no Zimmerman family departing for America, and immigration records at Ellis Island contained no matching entries. The family's claimed ancestry appeared to have no documentary foundation. When Bradford visited Helvetia in 1997 to present his findings, he discovered that Heinrich Zimmerman had died the previous winter. Anna remained on the property, now cared for by a younger man who identified himself as her grandson, Klaus Zimmerman. Klaus appeared to be in his 40s and spoke with the same slight German accent as his relatives. Bradford questioned Klaus about family records and documentation, but received only vague responses about papers being lost in a house fire decades earlier. Klaus seemed uncomfortable discussing his family's history and ended the interview abruptly when Bradford pressed for specific dates and details. State archivists subsequently attempted to verify Klaus Zimmerman's identity through standard databases, but found no records matching his name or description. Like his supposed grandparents, the telegraph key begins tapping at exactly 3:17 every Tuesday morning, though the wires were cut 40 years ago. Cass sits deep in the Pocahontas County mountains of West Virginia, a former company town built around timber operations that flourished from 1896 through 1960. The town was constructed to serve the West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company's logging railroad, which hauled timber from remote mountain camps down to processing facilities in the valley. At its peak, Cass housed over 2,000 residents in company-built homes arranged along steep hillsides overlooking the Greenbrier River. The Cass Scenic Railroad now operates the route as a tourist attraction, carrying visitors up the mountain on restored logging trains to experience the area's industrial heritage. The town itself has been preserved as a historical site, with original company buildings converted into visitor facilities and interpretive displays. Most structures remain as they were when the lumber operations ceased, creating an authentic glimpse into early 20th century Appalachian industrial life. The telegraph office occupied a small frame building adjacent to the railroad depot, serving as the primary communication link between Cass and the outside world during the town's active years. Telegraph operators maintained contact with lumber camps scattered across the surrounding mountains, coordinating train schedules and equipment deliveries through the single wire that connected Cass to the regional telegraph network. The office operated continuously from 1898 until 1958, when modern telephone service finally reached the remote mountain community. When the telegraph service was discontinued, the equipment was left in place as part of the historical preservation effort. The original telegraph key, receiver, and connecting apparatus remained mounted on their wooden operating table, though the external wires were removed and the system rendered completely non-functional. The building was sealed and incorporated into guided tours of the restored town, where visitors could observe authentic period communication equipment exactly as it had been used by generations of operators. The first report of unusual activity in the abandoned telegraph office came from night security guard Robert Hensley in March of 1996. Hensley was conducting his regular patrol of the historical site when he heard what sounded like Morse code tapping coming from inside the locked telegraph office. The sounds continued for approximately 20 minutes before stopping abruptly, following no pattern that Hensley could recognize. Hensley reported the incident to park management, suggesting that settling wood or thermal expansion might be causing mechanical sounds in the old building. Maintenance staff inspected the telegraph office, but found no obvious source for the sounds Hensley described. The equipment appeared undisturbed, and there were no signs of structural movement or pest activity that might account for rhythmic tapping noises. Similar incidents occurred sporadically over the following months, always during Hensley's overnight shifts and always seeming to originate from the telegraph office. By October of 1996, Hensley had documented 13 separate occasions when he heard Morse code transmissions from the decommissioned equipment. The sounds occurred exclusively on Tuesday nights, beginning at 3:17 in the morning and lasting between 15 and 30 minutes. Park Superintendent Janet Morrison initially dismissed Hensley's reports as imagination or misidentification of normal building sounds. But in December of 1996, Morrison happened to be working late in the administrative office when she heard distinct telegraph signals coming from across the compound. The sounds were unmistakably Morse code, transmitted with the precise timing and clarity of professional telegraph operation. Morrison unlocked the telegraph office and entered the building while the transmission was in progress. The sounds appeared to be coming directly from the vintage telegraph key, which remained motionless on its mounting table. The acoustic source of the tapping could not be located, though the sound seemed to emanate from the immediate vicinity of the original equipment. Morrison observed the phenomenon for 12 minutes before it stopped without explanation. Local amateur radio operator Dennis Crawford became interested in the Cass telegraph mystery after reading about it in a regional newspaper. Crawford had extensive experience with Morse code and offered to help park officials document and decode any transmissions they recorded. In February of 1997, Crawford set up recording equipment in the telegraph office and monitored the facility during several Tuesday night sessions. Crawford successfully recorded multiple transmissions and discovered that the phantom telegraph was sending coherent messages in standard international Morse code. The transmission technique was flawless, Crawford later wrote in his analysis report. Proper spacing, correct timing, professional-grade keying. This was not random noise or mechanical interference. Someone or something was sending real Morse code. The decoded messages contained detailed weather reports, including temperature readings, barometric pressure measurements, humidity levels, and precipitation forecasts. Each transmission began with a standard Weather Service identifier, followed by geographic coordinates that placed the reporting station somewhere in the Cass area, then comprehensive meteorological data presented in the format used by the National Weather Service. What made the messages unusual was their temporal displacement. Crawford discovered that the weather reports consistently described conditions for dates approximately 2 weeks in the future. A transmission received on February 18, 1997, contained detailed weather data from March 4th of the same year. The forecast included specific temperature readings, wind speeds, and storm predictions that would not be verifiable until the indicated date arrived. Crawford began tracking the accuracy of these phantom forecasts and found them remarkably precise. The March 4th weather in Cass matched the phantom transmission's predictions to within 1/10 of 1 degree for temperature and 5% for humidity levels. Subsequent transmissions showed similar accuracy, providing weather forecasts that proved more reliable than official National Weather Service predictions for the same area. Dr. Susan Martinez, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service office in Charleston, reviewed Crawford's documentation at his request. Martinez confirmed that the phantom transmissions followed proper weather reporting protocols and contained data types consistent with official meteorological observations. However, she noted several irregularities that suggested the information was not originating from any known weather monitoring system. The coordinate system was correct for the Cass area, but it referenced a weather station that never existed, Martinez explained in her written assessment. The closest official weather monitoring equipment was dismantled in 1958, and no automated systems have ever been installed in that immediate vicinity. Martinez also noted that the data formatting matched protocols used by the Weather Bureau during the 1940s and 50s, rather than modern National Weather Service standards. The phantom transmissions appeared to be using outdated reporting procedures that had been discontinued decades before the mysterious telegraph activity began. In 1998, Crawford expanded his documentation efforts by installing more sophisticated recording equipment capable of analyzing the electromagnetic signatures of the phantom transmissions. He discovered that while the Morse code sounds were clearly audible, no electromagnetic activity accompanied them. The telegraph signals produced no radio frequency emissions, magnetic field variations, or electrical current flow that would normally be associated with actual telegraph operation. It was like listening to the ghost of a transmission, Crawford wrote in his technical report. All the acoustic properties of real Morse code, but none of the electrical characteristics. The sounds existed without any physical mechanism to produce them. Park officials contacted the National Institute of Standards and Technology to investigate the Cass telegraph phenomenon, hoping that federal scientists might explain the apparent temporal displacement in the weather forecasts. NIST dispatched a team of researchers in April of 1999 to study the equipment and monitor the Tuesday night transmissions. The federal investigation team included specialists in electromagnetic phenomena, acoustic analysis, and historical communication systems. They documented multiple phantom transmissions over a 3-week period, confirming Crawford's findings about the accuracy of the future weather forecasts and the absence of any detectable electromagnetic activity. Lead researcher Dr. Patricia Woodward noted that the telegraph key mechanism showed no signs of recent use or mechanical wear that would indicate actual operation. Microscopic analysis revealed that dust and corrosion patterns on the equipment were consistent with 40 years of abandonment, with no evidence that any components had moved or been manipulated since the telegraph service was discontinued. The NIST team also investigated the possibility that the sounds might be originating from some external source and somehow focusing on the telegraph office through acoustic effects. However, extensive sound mapping of the area revealed no potential sources for the precisely timed Morse code transmissions, and the acoustic properties of the building could not account for the phenomena. After completing their investigation, the NIST team classified their findings and declined to publish their results. Dr. Woodward was reassigned to other projects, and subsequent requests for information about the Cass investigation were referred to federal security agencies that refused to comment on the matter. Local documentation of the phantom telegraph continued, despite the official silence. Amateur radio enthusiasts from across the region began visiting Cass on Tuesday nights to witness the transmissions firsthand. An informal network of monitors developed, tracking the accuracy of the phantom weather forecasts and sharing recordings of the mysterious Morse code messages. The phantom forecasts maintained their remarkable accuracy throughout the early 2000s, consistently providing weather predictions that proved more reliable than conventional meteorological services. During severe weather events, the phantom transmissions included detailed warnings about storm intensity and timing that allowed local residents to prepare more effectively than they could have using official forecasts. In 2003, a severe ice storm struck the Cass area with unusual intensity, causing widespread power outages and dangerous travel conditions. The phantom telegraph transmission received 2 weeks earlier had predicted the storm with precise timing and accurately forecasted ice accumulations that exceeded official Weather Service estimates by significant margins. Park Ranger Michael Torres, who had been monitoring the phantom transmissions for several years, noted that the mysterious weather station appeared to have access to meteorological data that was unavailable to conventional forecasting systems. It was like someone was getting perfect information about future weather patterns from sources we couldn't identify or understand, Torres observed. Today, the Phantom Telegraph continues its weekly transmissions, delivering weather forecasts that arrive precisely at 3:17 every Tuesday morning. The predictions maintain their extraordinary accuracy, providing meteorological data that consistently outperforms modern computerized forecasting systems. Park officials no longer discuss the phenomenon publicly, and the telegraph office has been removed from guided tour routes. The building remains locked, though the sounds of phantom Morse code still echo from within every Tuesday night, tapping out weather reports for a tomorrow that hasn't happened yet. The messages arrive from a weather station that was never built, transmitted by equipment that hasn't worked for 40 years, carrying information that won't be available for 2 more weeks. The telegraph that never stopped continues its precise schedule, marking time with dots and dashes that spell out the future in a language only the past remembers how to speak. The school bell rings every morning at 8:15 sharp, calling children who graduated 70 years ago. Thurmond sits along a remote bend of the New River in Summers County, West Virginia, accessible only by a single-lane bridge that crosses the water from the main highway. The town was established in 1888 as a division point for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, growing rapidly into one of the busiest rail yards in the southern Appalachians. At its peak in the 1920s, Thurmond processed over 75,000 rail cars annually, making it a crucial link in the coal transportation network that powered American industry. The town was built entirely on one side of the river, with all structures squeezed between the railroad tracks and steep mountain slopes that allowed no room for expansion. Main Street consisted of a single row of buildings facing the tracks, including banks, hotels, restaurants, and commercial establishments that served railroad workers and traveling businessmen. The community never grew beyond a few hundred permanent residents, but its strategic location made it one of the wealthiest towns per capita in West Virginia during the railroad boom years. Thurmond's decline began in the 1930s as diesel locomotives replaced steam engines and railroad operations consolidated into larger facilities elsewhere. The last passenger train stopped in 1956, and freight operations gradually diminished until only occasional coal trains passed through the abandoned yards. By 1990, the town's population had dwindled to fewer than 10 residents, most of them elderly retirees who had spent their lives working for the railroad. The Thurmond School occupied a 2-story brick building constructed in 1908 to serve the children of railroad families. The school operated through 8th grade, with high school students traveling to nearby towns for their education. A large bronze bell, mounted in a wooden tower above the main entrance, called students to classes each morning, its deep tone audible throughout the narrow valley where Thurmond nestled between river and mountain. When enrollment dropped below the minimum required by state education standards, Thurmond School closed permanently in May of 1950. The building was abandoned in place, with desks, blackboards, and educational materials left exactly as they had been on the last day of classes. The bronze bell remained in its tower, though the rope mechanism used to ring it was removed when the building was sealed. The first report of unusual activity at the abandoned school came from railroad maintenance worker Carl Hensley. In September of 1983, Hensley was inspecting track conditions near Thurmond when he heard the school bell ring at 8:15 in the morning, followed immediately by the sound of children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. The voices seemed to be coming from inside the sealed school building, though Hensley could see that all windows and doors remained locked and undisturbed. Hensley reported the incident to the Norfolk Southern Railway, which owned the abandoned building along with most other structures in Thurmond. Company officials noted the report, but took no action, assuming that Hensley had misidentified sounds from passing trains or construction equipment working somewhere upstream along the river. Similar reports began accumulating from the handful of residents who remained in Thurmond. Margaret Dotson, whose family had operated a boarding house in the town since 1920, confirmed that she heard the school bell ring every weekday morning at exactly 8:15, always followed by children's voices reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in unison. The sounds occurred regardless of weather conditions and continued through weekends and holidays when schools throughout the region were closed. It was the same as when I was a girl and walked to school here, Dotson told a reporter from the Charleston Gazette in 1985. The bell would ring, and then you'd hear all the children saying the pledge before classes started. Except now, there haven't been any children in this town for 30 years. Local postmaster Robert Mills, who delivered mail to the 5 remaining households in Thurmond, reported hearing the phantom school bell during his morning rounds. Mills had attended Thurmond School as a child in the 1940s and recognized both the bell's distinctive tone and the familiar cadence of the morning pledge ritual that had begun each school day. The voices sounded exactly like I remembered from when I was in second grade, Mills said in a 1987 interview. Same rhythm, same timing. But there was something different about the way they pronounced certain words. It sounded old-fashioned, like how my grandmother used to talk. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a linguistics professor at West Virginia University, became interested in the Thurmond phenomenon after reading newspaper accounts of the mysterious voices. Martinez specialized in Appalachian dialect preservation and had extensive experience documenting regional speech patterns that were disappearing as younger generations moved away from isolated mountain communities. In October of 1988, Martinez traveled to Thurmond with audio recording equipment to document the phantom school bell and voices. She positioned sensitive microphones around the abandoned school building and monitored the site during several early morning sessions. On her third attempt, Martinez successfully recorded both the bell and the subsequent recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance. Analysis of the recordings revealed several unusual characteristics in the children's voices. The pronunciation patterns and grammatical structures matched Appalachian dialects that Martinez estimated had not been commonly spoken since the 1890s. Specific phonetic features in the recording corresponded to linguistic research documenting how English was spoken in remote West Virginia communities during the late 19th century. The children were reciting the modern version of the Pledge of Allegiance, which wasn't adopted until 1954, Martinez noted in her research report. But they were pronouncing it using speech patterns that had died out 60 years before that version existed. It was like hearing voices from the 1890s speaking words from the 1950s. Martinez also discovered that the phantom voices were reciting the pledge with certain variations that reflected the exact version taught in West Virginia schools between 1954 and 1963. The specific wording included phrases that were later modified by state education standards, suggesting that the voices were somehow connected to the precise time period when Thurmond School was closing due to declining enrollment. The National Park Service, which had begun acquiring properties in Thurmond for potential inclusion in the New River Gorge National River, commissioned an acoustic study of the abandoned school building in 1991. Sound engineers used specialized equipment to map the building's acoustic properties and identify any mechanical systems that might be producing the mysterious sounds. The engineering study revealed that the school bell was physically incapable of ringing without external force. The bronze bell remained properly mounted in its tower, but all ropes, pulleys, and mechanical linkages had been removed decades earlier. No electrical systems existed in the building that could trigger automated bell ringing, and no evidence of recent human access to the bell tower could be found. Acoustic analysis of the building's interior showed that the phantom voices could not be originating from any external source. The sealed nature of the structure would prevent outside sounds from producing the clear, coherent speech patterns recorded by multiple witnesses. Sound engineers concluded that if voices were actually being produced inside the building, they would have to originate from within the structure itself. Park Service investigators also examined historical enrollment records for Thurmond School, attempting to correlate the phantom voices with specific students who had attended classes during the school's final years. Records showed that the last graduating class in 1950 contained only 7 students, all of whom had been accounted for in subsequent decades. None of the surviving former students reported any connection to the mysterious morning ritual that continued in their abandoned school. Federal interest in the Thurmond phenomenon intensified when acoustic researchers discovered that the phantom voices were somehow producing measurable sound waves without any apparent physical source. Sensitive vibration detectors placed inside the sealed school building recorded acoustic activity, consistent with multiple speakers, but thermal imaging and motion sensors detected no corresponding human presence. Dr. James Chen, a physicist specializing in acoustic anomalies, visited Thurmond in 1993 to investigate the sound production mechanism. Chen's equipment confirmed that voices were being generated inside the building through unknown means, creating sound pressure waves that could be measured and analyzed, despite the absence of any visible speakers. We were detecting real acoustic phenomena with definite measurable properties, Chen wrote in his classified report to the Department of Energy. But the sound sources appeared to exist without any corresponding physical objects. It was like measuring the voices of people who weren't there. Chen's investigation was terminated abruptly when his federal funding was withdrawn without explanation. His equipment was confiscated by unidentified government agents, and his research data was classified under national security provisions that prevented him from discussing his findings publicly. Chen was reassigned to other projects and declined to comment when contacted by journalists investigating the Thurmond mystery. Local documentation of the phantom school bell continued despite the official silence. Amateur audio enthusiasts began visiting Thurmond to record the morning phenomenon, sharing their findings through informal networks that tracked the consistency and accuracy of the mysterious daily ritual. The recordings showed that the phantom voices maintained perfect timing and pronunciation, never varying from their 8:15 schedule or their precise recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance. In 2001, the National Park Service acquired the abandoned Thurmond School building as part of the New River Gorge National River designation. The structure was sealed more securely and posted with signs warning visitors to stay away from the property. Park rangers were instructed not to discuss the building or acknowledge any reports of unusual sounds emanating from the site. Today, the 5 remaining residents of Thurmond continue to hear the school bell ring every weekday morning at 8:15, followed by the familiar sound of children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. The voices speak in a dialect that linguists say disappeared more than a century ago, yet they recite words from a pledge that wasn't written until the school had already closed. The phantom students maintain their perfect attendance, never missing a morning, never varying their schedule. They gather in a classroom that has been empty for 70 years, speaking in voices that echo from a past that somehow learned to recite a future it would never see. The bell tower stands silent and still against the morning sky, its bronze bell motionless in the windless air. Yet its sound carries across the water every school day at 8:15, calling children who will never be late for class again. The water began dripping differently 3 days before the earthquake in Japan. Though the mine shaft sits 4,000 miles away, in West Virginia. Kayford Mountain rises 1,500 feet above the Kanawha River Valley in Kanawha County, West Virginia. Its ridgeline scarred by decades of mountaintop removal mining operations. The mountain contains some of the richest coal seams in Appalachia. Deposits formed 300 million years ago, when the region lay beneath ancient swamps and shallow seas. Coal companies have extracted over 50 million tons of coal from Kayford Mountain since mining began in the 1920s, leaving behind a landscape of exposed rock faces, equipment roads, and abandoned extraction sites. The Kayford Mountain area represents the environmental and economic tensions that define modern Appalachia. While mining operations provided employment for generations of local families, the mountaintop removal process has fundamentally altered the region's topography and hydrology. Massive dragline excavators stripped away hundreds of feet of rock and soil to expose coal seams, creating artificial plateaus where mountain peaks once stood. Environmental activists have used Kayford Mountain as a symbol of mountaintop removal's impact, conducting tours of active and abandoned mining sites to demonstrate the scale of landscape modification. The mountain contains numerous abandoned mine shafts from earlier underground extraction operations, vertical openings that descend hundreds of feet into the earth before intersecting horizontal tunnels that follow coal seams through the rock. Most of these abandoned shafts were sealed with concrete caps when underground mining ceased, but a few remain open as ventilation points for ongoing operations or access routes for monitoring equipment. One particular shaft, located on the eastern slope of Kayford Mountain, approximately 300 yards from the main haul road, has become the focus of an unusual phenomenon that has attracted attention from both local residents and international researchers. The shaft in question was originally excavated in 1934 as part of the Kayford No. 7 mine complex, operated by the Consolidation Coal Company. The vertical opening descends 400 feet through layers of sandstone and shale before intersecting the main coal seam that runs horizontally through the mountain. When underground operations ended in 1962, the shaft was left uncapped to serve as a ventilation point for adjacent workings that remained active until the early 1980s. Local resident Dorothy Mills first noticed unusual sounds coming from the abandoned shaft in March of 1999. Mills lived in a trailer home approximately half a mile from the mine site and often walked her dogs along old mining roads that crisscrossed the mountainside. During one of these walks, she heard what sounded like water dripping with an irregular rhythm emanating from the open shaft. It wasn't constant dripping like you'd expect from groundwater seepage, Mills later explained to a reporter from the Charleston Daily Mail. The rhythm kept changing, speeding up and slowing down in patterns. Sometimes it would drip fast for maybe 10 minutes, then slow down, then speed up again. It was like listening to some kind of code. Mills began paying closer attention to the dripping patterns during her regular walks, noting that the rhythm seemed to follow cycles that lasted several days. She started keeping a journal of the variations, recording the approximate timing and duration of different dripping sequences. After several months of observation, Mills noticed that significant changes in the dripping pattern seemed to precede major news events, particularly natural disasters reported on television. The connection became apparent to Mills after the devastating earthquake that struck Turkey in August of 1999. 3 days before the magnitude 7.4 earthquake killed over 17,000 people, Mills had recorded a dramatic change in the mine shaft's dripping pattern. The steady rhythm that had persisted for weeks suddenly became rapid and erratic, continuing for approximately 18 hours before returning to its previous cadence. Mills mentioned the correlation to her neighbor, retired coal miner Harold Thompson, who had worked underground at various Kayford Mountain operations for 38 years before the mines closed. Thompson was skeptical of Mills's observations but agreed to listen to the shaft during one of his daily walks around the abandoned mining sites where he had spent his career. "I knew that particular shaft from when I worked the No. 7 operation," Thompson said in a 2000 interview. It always had water problems, groundwater seeping through fractured rock. But Dorothy was right about the rhythm changes. I could hear it too, and it didn't sound like normal groundwater behavior. Thompson's mining experience gave him insight into the geological factors that might influence water movement through abandoned mine workings. He explained that underground water flow typically remained consistent unless affected by seasonal precipitation patterns or changes in atmospheric pressure. The rapid rhythm changes Mills had observed did not correspond to any known geological or meteorological phenomena. Word of the mine shaft's unusual behavior spread through the small community of families who still lived near the abandoned mining sites on Cayford Mountain. Several residents began monitoring the shaft's dripping patterns and comparing notes about when significant changes occurred. A pattern emerged that seemed to correlate the timing of rhythm variations with major seismic events around the world. Dr. Patricia Chen, a seismologist at Virginia Tech University, learned about the Cayford Mountain phenomenon through a colleague who had heard local radio reports about the supposed earthquake predictions. Chen was initially skeptical, but became curious enough to investigate when residents provided her with documentation of apparent correlations between the shaft's behavior and several significant earthquakes that had occurred during proper 2000 and 2001. Chen visited Cayford Mountain in September of 2001, accompanied by graduate student Michael Rodriguez, who specialized in groundwater hydrology. They spent 3 days documenting the mine shaft's acoustic properties and attempting to identify the source of the rhythmic dripping sounds that local residents had described. The shaft definitely contained flowing water at a depth of approximately 400 feet, Chen wrote in her preliminary report. We could hear consistent dripping sounds that appeared to originate from groundwater seepage through fractured rock formations. The acoustic properties were consistent with water drops falling into a pool at the bottom of the shaft. Chen and Rodriguez installed hydrophones and seismic monitoring equipment around the shaft to record any variations in the dripping patterns. They also established baseline measurements of local groundwater flow rates and atmospheric conditions that might influence water movement through the abandoned mine workings. The researchers' equipment documented the rhythmic dripping that residents had reported, confirming that the sound patterns varied in ways that did not correlate with local environmental factors. Over the course of their 3-day study, Chen and Rodriguez recorded several instances of dramatic rhythm changes that occurred without corresponding changes in barometric pressure, precipitation, or seismic activity in the immediate area. More significantly, their visit coincided with a period when the dripping pattern underwent the type of dramatic change that residents claimed preceded major earthquakes. The rhythm shifted from a steady pattern of approximately 1 drip every 3 seconds to rapid sequences of multiple drops, separated by longer periods of silence. This irregular pattern continued for nearly 20 hours before reverting to its previous steady cadence. Exactly 72 hours after the rhythm change ended, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck El Salvador, killing more than 800 people and causing widespread destruction throughout the region. The precise timing correlation between the mine shaft's behavior and the distant seismic event convinced Chen that the phenomenon warranted further investigation. Chen returned to Cayford Mountain multiple times over the following 2 years, bringing increasingly sophisticated monitoring equipment to document the shaft's apparent ability to predict earthquakes. Her research team recorded dozens of instances when rhythm changes preceded significant seismic events around the world, with the timing consistently showing the same 72-hour advance warning pattern. We documented correlations with earthquakes in Turkey, India, Afghanistan, Iran, and Peru, Chen noted in her 2003 research summary. The mine shaft's dripping pattern changed exactly 72 hours before each event, regardless of the earthquake's location or magnitude. The phenomenon appeared to be responding to global seismic activity rather than local geological conditions. Chen's findings attracted attention from the United States Geological Survey, which dispatched a team of researchers to verify her observations and investigate potential mechanisms that might explain the mineshaft's predictive behavior. The USGS team, led by Dr. Robert Martinez, spent 6 months monitoring the shaft using equipment capable of detecting minute changes in groundwater pressure and underground acoustic phenomena. The federal investigation confirmed Chen's documentation of the 72-hour correlation between rhythm changes and distant earthquakes. USGS researchers recorded the phenomenon preceding major seismic events in Japan, Chile, and Indonesia, with timing that matched the pattern Chen had established through her previous studies. However, the USGS team could not identify any known geological or hydrological mechanism that would allow groundwater in a West Virginia mineshaft to respond to tectonic activity on other continents. The shaft showed no detectable connection to regional fault systems, and its hydrological properties appeared completely isolated from global seismic networks. The correlations are statistically significant and repeatedly observable, Martinez wrote in his classified report to USGS headquarters. But we cannot explain how local groundwater could somehow anticipate seismic events occurring thousands of miles away. The phenomenon challenges our understanding of how underground water systems interact with global tectonic processes. The USGS study was terminated in 2004 when federal funding was redirected to other seismic research priorities. Martinez and his team were reassigned to different projects, and their monitoring equipment was removed from Kayford Mountain. Subsequent requests for information about the investigation were referred to security agencies that declined to comment on the research findings. Local residents continued documenting the mineshaft's earthquake predictions, despite the end of official scientific interest. Community members established an informal network that tracked rhythm changes and compared them with global seismic activity reported through news media and internet sources. The correlations remained consistent, with the shaft continuing to provide 72-hour advance warning of major earthquakes around the world. Environmental activists visiting Kayford Mountain to observe mountaintop removal operations occasionally learned about the mineshaft's unusual properties from local residents. However, most visitors focused on the visible environmental impacts of surface mining rather than the subtle acoustic phenomena occurring in abandoned underground workings. Dr. Chen continued monitoring the shaft informally through contacts in the local community who reported significant rhythm changes to her by telephone. She maintained her own database of correlations, documenting hundreds of instances when the mineshaft's behavior preceded distant earthquakes with the same precise timing that had characterized her original observations. The phenomenon has remained completely consistent for over 2 decades, Chen noted in a 2020 interview conducted by telephone. The shaft continues to predict earthquakes with remarkable accuracy, but we're no closer to understanding how or why this happens. Today, the abandoned mine shaft on Kayford Mountain continues its mysterious function as an earthquake barometer, its dripping rhythm changing exactly 72 hours before major seismic events occur anywhere on Earth. Local residents still monitor the sounds emanating from 400 feet underground, listening for the irregular patterns that signal impending disaster in places they will never see. The water drops fall through darkness in a rhythm that somehow knows the future, marking time until distant continents shift and buildings fall, connected to global catastrophe by forces that science cannot name or measure. Deep beneath a scarred mountain in West Virginia, groundwater keeps perfect time with the planet's pulse, counting down to earthquakes that haven't happened yet. The radio station broadcasts from a year that ended 70 years ago, reaching listeners in a present it was never meant to see. Greenbank sits in a remote valley of Pocahontas County, West Virginia, surrounded by mountains that create a natural barrier against radio frequency interference. The town was established in the 1870s as a farming community, But its destiny changed in 1956 when the National Radio Astronomy Observatory chose the location for its radio telescope facility. The combination of geographic isolation and minimal electronic infrastructure made Green Bank ideal for detecting faint signals from distant galaxies and stellar phenomena. The observatory's requirements led to the creation of the National Radio Quiet Zone in 1958, a 13,000 square mile area where radio transmissions are strictly regulated to prevent interference with astronomical observations. Within this zone, cellular phones, microwave ovens, and wireless internet are prohibited or severely limited. The restrictions create an electronic silence that allows the radio telescope to detect signals billions of times weaker than those produced by typical household devices. Green Bank's population has never exceeded a few hundred residents, most of them employees of the observatory or family members who work in supporting businesses. The town maintains the character of a 1950s rural community, partly by necessity due to the electronic restrictions, and partly by choice among residents who appreciate the slower pace of life that comes with technological limitations. The unique electromagnetic environment of Green Bank has created conditions unlike anywhere else in the United States. Radio waves that would normally be overwhelmed by electronic noise can travel unusually long distances in the quiet zone, and signals that might be undetectable elsewhere become clear and strong. This unusual radio environment may explain why residents occasionally receive broadcasts that appear to originate from decades in the past. The first documented report of anachronistic radio broadcasts in Green Bank came from observatory technician Robert Hayes in October of 1989. Hayes was driving home from his evening shift when his car radio picked up what appeared to be a local AM station, identifying itself as WVOL, broadcasting from Green Bank. The programming consisted of local news, weather reports, and community announcements delivered in the style typical of 1950s radio. The announcer was talking about the weather for tomorrow, October 15th, but he said it was 1953, Hayes later wrote in his incident report. He mentioned local businesses and people I'd never heard of, but he spoke about them like everyone in town would know who he meant. The whole broadcast sounded completely authentic, like it was really coming from 36 years ago. Hayes attempted to retune his radio to locate the station again, but WVOL had vanished from the frequency. He noted the incident in his daily log, but initially assumed he had somehow received a distant signal that was being reflected or amplified by atmospheric conditions in the radio quiet zone. Similar reports began accumulating from other residents, who occasionally picked up WVOL during evening hours, usually between 7 and 9 o'clock. The station always identified itself with the same call letters and claimed to be broadcasting from Green Bank in 1953, though no record of any such station existed in Federal Communications Commission archives from that time period. Margaret Sutton, who had lived in Green Bank since 1947, became interested in the Phantom radio station after hearing broadcasts that referenced people and places from her childhood. Sutton recognized many of the names mentioned in the station's community announcements, though most of the people had died decades earlier. The announcer talked about Harold Morrison getting a new tractor for his farm, but Harold died in 1962, Sutton said in a 1992 interview. He mentioned the Saturday dance at Grange Hall, which burned down in 1958. Everything he said was accurate for how things were in the early 50s, but he was talking about it like it was happening right then. Sutton began keeping a journal of WVOL broadcasts she encountered, noting the specific content and comparing it with her memories of Green Bank during the 1950s. The Phantom station's programming included weather forecasts, crop reports, and social announcements that matched historical records from the period the station claimed to represent. Observatory electronics specialist David Chen became aware of the WVOL phenomenon when multiple residents asked him to explain how they might be receiving broadcasts from the 1950s. Chen's expertise in radio frequency analysis made him curious about the technical aspects of the mysterious transmissions. In November of 1993, Chen set up monitoring equipment to analyze any WVOL broadcasts that might occur during his observation periods. Using spectrum analyzers and signal processing equipment normally used for astronomical research, Chen attempted to trace the source and characteristics of the phantom radio station. The signal appeared to be coming from somewhere in the immediate Greenbank area, Chen noted in his technical report. The frequency was 5910 kHz, which was within the AM band, and the signal strength suggested a local transmitter. But there was no record of any broadcast facility operating on that frequency, and a physical search of the area revealed no transmission equipment. Chen's analysis revealed other unusual characteristics of the WVOL broadcasts. The signal showed no signs of the frequency drift or power fluctuations typical of amateur radio operations, suggesting professional-grade transmission equipment. However, the audio quality and technical specifications matched broadcast standards from the 1950s, rather than modern radio technology. The content of the broadcasts remained consistently anchored in 1953, with the phantom announcer providing weather forecasts, community news, and social announcements as if that year were ongoing. The programming never acknowledged events that occurred after 1953, creating a temporal bubble that seemed isolated from subsequent decades. Local historian Patricia Mueller began researching the possibility that WVOL might have been a legitimate radio station that operated briefly in Greenbank during the early 1950s. Mueller searched Federal Communications Commission records, local newspapers, and regional broadcasting archives for any evidence of a station using those call letters in the area. Mueller's investigation revealed that several small radio stations had operated in rural West Virginia during the 1940s and 50s, often with minimal documentation due to limited federal oversight of small market broadcasting. However, she found no official record of any station using the WVOL call letters or claiming to broadcast from Greenbank during that time period. There were definitely small stations operating in isolated areas that might not have kept complete records, Mueller explained in a 1995 interview. But WVOL doesn't appear in any of the documentation I've found. It's possible the station operated without proper licensing, but that would have been unusual for a facility with such professional-sounding programming. The National Radio Astronomy Observatory became officially aware of the WVOL phenomenon when residents began asking whether the mysterious broadcasts might interfere with telescope operations. Observatory Director Dr. Complin Michael Torres commissioned a study to determine whether the phantom radio station posed any threat to astronomical research activities. The observatory's investigation, conducted in 1996, used the facility's most sensitive radio detection equipment to monitor the frequency where WVOL broadcasts allegedly occurred. The study team documented multiple instances of signals appearing on the frequency that matched witness descriptions of the phantom radio station. We detected coherent radio transmissions that appeared to contain voice programming consistent with AM radio broadcasts from the 1950s, Torres wrote in his summary report. However, direction-finding analysis could not identify the source of these transmissions, and no unauthorized broadcast equipment was located within the radio quiet zone. The observatory study also revealed that the WVOL broadcasts showed unusual propagation characteristics that did not match normal radio wave behavior. The signals appeared to be strongest in certain geographic areas around Greenbank, creating reception patterns that suggested multiple transmission points or unusual atmospheric focusing effects. Federal Communications Commission investigators visited Greenbank in 1997 to address complaints about unlicensed broadcasting in the radio quiet zone. FCC engineers used mobile direction-finding equipment to locate the source of the WVOL transmissions during monitoring operations that lasted 3 weeks. The federal investigation confirmed the existence of regular broadcasts on the frequency associated with WVOL, but could not locate any transmission equipment or identify the source of the signals. FCC engineers noted that the broadcasts violated regulations governing both unlicensed operation and content that could interfere with observatory activities. "We documented multiple violations of federal broadcasting regulations," wrote FCC Enforcement Officer Janet Peterson in her official report. However, standard enforcement procedures cannot be applied when the source of the violations cannot be identified or located. The FCC investigation file was subsequently classified and removed from public access. Peterson and her investigation team were reassigned to other duties, and follow-up inquiries about the Green Bank case were referred to federal security agencies that declined to comment on the matter. Local residents continued receiving WVOL broadcasts despite the federal investigation, though the frequency of transmissions appeared to decrease after 1997. The Phantom radio station maintained its consistent programming format, providing news and announcements for a version of Green Bank that existed only in 1953. Amateur radio enthusiasts from outside the area began visiting Green Bank to listen for WVOL broadcasts, though most reported difficulty receiving the station despite using sensitive equipment. The Phantom broadcasts seemed to favor longtime residents and people with strong connections to the community over casual visitors or researchers. In 2005, the National Radio Astronomy Observatory upgraded its primary radio telescope with more sensitive detection equipment capable of monitoring a broader range of frequencies. The enhanced capability allowed astronomers to conduct more detailed studies of the Phantom broadcasts while maintaining their primary mission of astronomical research. Observatory technician Linda Carter, who monitored radio frequency interference as part of her duties, documented over 40 WVOL transmissions between 2006 and 2010. Carter noted that the broadcasts continued to maintain their temporal anchor in 1953, while occasionally incorporating subtle references to people and events that suggested awareness of later developments. The announcer mentioned Martha Reynolds winning a prize at the county fair, but Martha Reynolds moved away from Green Bank in 1955, Carter observed in her monitoring log. It was like the station somehow knew about things that happened after 1953, but was pretending they were happening during that year instead. Today, WVOL continues its sporadic broadcasts from a year that ended 7 decades ago, reaching listeners in a present that the Phantom announcer never acknowledges. The station maintains its programming schedule of local news, weather, and community announcements for a version of Green Bank that exists somewhere between memory and possibility. Residents still occasionally encounter the Phantom radio station during evening drives or while scanning frequencies on vintage radios that can receive the broadcasts more clearly than modern equipment. The announcer's voice remains steady and professional, delivering news from 1953 with the confidence of someone who believes tomorrow will arrive right on schedule. The radio waves carry voices and music from a time that refuses to end, broadcasting into a future that listens but cannot respond, maintaining perfect fidelity to a moment that plays on endless repeat in the quiet zone, where electronic silence allows the past to speak. The trees simply stopped growing in a line so straight, it could only have been drawn with instruments that didn't exist when the forest began. Spruce Knob rises 4,763 feet above sea level in the Monongahela National Forest of West Virginia, making it the highest point in the state. The mountain sits within the Spruce Knob Seneca Rocks National Recreation Area, a wilderness preserve that protects some of the oldest forest ecosystems in the Central Appalachians. The summit is crowned with red spruce trees that can live for 400 years, creating a boreal forest environment more typical of northern Canada than the mid-Atlantic region. The mountain's elevation and geographic isolation have preserved plant and animal communities that disappeared from surrounding lower elevations as climate patterns changed over centuries. Botanists consider Spruce Knob a living museum of pre-settlement Appalachian ecology, containing tree species and forest structures that once covered much of the eastern mountains before European colonization and industrial development. Access to the summit is limited to a single gravel road that winds 7 miles up the mountainside from the nearest highway. The Forest Service maintains a fire tower at the peak, staffed during dry seasons to watch for smoke from forest fires that could threaten the surrounding wilderness areas. The tower provides the only elevated vantage point capable of surveying the entire mountain and its complex network of ridges and valleys. Fire tower observers have long noted unusual features in the forest canopy that are visible only from above. Among these is a phenomenon that has puzzled foresters and cartographers since the tower was constructed in 1953. A perfectly straight line, where no trees grow, cutting through otherwise dense old-growth forest for a distance of exactly 2.7 miles. Forest Service lookout Robert Chen first documented the treeless line in his daily observation log on June 18, 1954. Chen had been assigned to the Spruce Knob Tower for his second season and was conducting routine surveys of forest conditions when he noticed what appeared to be a cleared corridor running northeast from the summit area. From the tower, you can see a line where no trees are growing, Chen wrote in his incident report. It runs straight as an arrow for what looks like several miles, maybe 2 or 3. No stumps visible, no signs of cutting or fire damage. Just bare ground, where trees should be growing like everywhere else on the mountain. Chen reported the observation to forest supervisors, who initially assumed the line represented an old logging road or survey boundary from earlier land management activities. However, historical records showed no logging operations or survey work that would account for a cleared corridor in that location. And topographic maps from the 1920s showed the area as continuously forested. Subsequent fire tower observers confirmed Chen's documentation of the treeless line, noting that it remained consistent in width and direction across multiple growing seasons. The corridor appeared to be approximately 15 feet wide and maintained perfect straightness despite crossing varied terrain, including steep slopes, rocky outcrops, and stream valleys that would normally cause survey lines to deviate. Forest Service botanist Dr. Patricia Mills investigated the treeless corridor in August of 1957, hiking to various points along its length to examine the ground conditions and vegetation patterns. Mills found that the line contained no tree stumps, root systems, or other evidence that trees had ever grown in the affected area. The soil, composition, and moisture levels are identical to surrounding areas where healthy old-growth forest is thriving, Mills wrote in her field report. All environmental conditions appear optimal for tree growth, yet no vegetation of any kind will establish itself within the corridor. The boundary between the treeless zone and normal forest is sharp and precise, with no transitional area. Mills collected soil samples from multiple points along the line and compared them with samples from adjacent forested areas. Laboratory analysis revealed no chemical contamination, unusual mineral content, or other factors that might prevent plant growth. The soil within the corridor appeared to be identical to surrounding forest soil in all measurable characteristics. Ground surveys conducted by Forest Service crews in 1958 revealed that the treeless line extended beyond the boundaries of the National Forest, continuing across privately owned land in Pendleton County before disappearing into remote mountain wilderness. Property owners along the line confirmed that the vegetation gap had existed as long as anyone could remember, though none had any explanation for why trees would not grow in that specific location. The precise bearing and distance of the treeless line became a subject of interest for cartographers attempting to understand its relationship to historical survey work in the region. Survey teams using theodolites and measuring chains determined that the line maintained a bearing of 47 degrees northeast and extended for exactly 2.7 miles from its starting point near the Spruce Knob summit. More significantly, cartographers discovered that extending the line beyond its visible endpoints would connect Spruce Knob directly to the location of a planned but never constructed town in southeastern Ohio. Historical records from the 1840s showed that railroad investors had proposed establishing a community called Millfield at the projected intersection of two proposed rail lines that would have connected Cincinnati with Charleston, West Virginia. The Millfield development was abandoned in 1847 when financial difficulties prevented construction of the planned railroad routes. The proposed town site remained undeveloped farmland, but the original survey plans showed that a direct line from the intended town center to Spruce Knob would follow exactly the same bearing as the mysterious treeless corridor. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a geographer at West Virginia University, became interested in the Spruce Knob line after learning about its connection to the abandoned Ohio town site. Rodriguez's research into 19th century surveying practices revealed that railroad companies often established sightlines between distant points to guide construction of rail routes across mountainous terrain. Railroad surveyors used elevated peaks like Spruce Knob as reference points for establishing straight routes across difficult terrain. Rodriguez explained in his 1962 research paper. They would clear sightlines through forests to maintain accurate bearings across long distances. But there's no record of any railroad survey work in this area, and the proposed route to Ohio was never actually surveyed. Rodriguez's investigation revealed another puzzling aspect of the treeless line. Historical accounts suggested it had existed before any known surveying activity in the region. Cherokee hunting parties from the 1800s had reportedly used the corridor as a travel route, referring to it as a path that had always been there. Early European explorers noted the presence of a natural clearway through the forest, though none provided detailed descriptions of its characteristics. The Forest Service commissioned an aerial photographic survey of the Spruce Knob area in 1965, using the new technology to document forest conditions and management needs throughout the National Recreation Area. The aerial photographs clearly showed the treeless line as a distinct feature cutting through otherwise unbroken forest canopy. Analysis of the aerial imagery revealed additional details about the line's characteristics. The corridor maintained exactly the same width along its entire length, showing no variation that would be expected from natural erosion or weathering processes. The edges of the treeless zone appeared sharp and definitive, with mature trees growing right to the boundary without any intermediate zone of stunted or damaged vegetation. Federal interest in the Spruce Knob phenomenon increased when the United States Geological Survey began conducting comprehensive mapping studies of Appalachian wilderness areas during the 1970s. USGS cartographers noted discrepancies between ground surveys and aerial photography that suggested the treeless line might be influencing magnetic compass readings in the immediate area. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geophysicist with the USGS, investigated the magnetic anomalies around Spruce Knob using sensitive magnetometer equipment designed to detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. Chen's survey revealed that magnetic compass readings showed slight but consistent deflection when taken along the treeless corridor, suggesting the presence of some underground feature that affected local magnetic properties. We measured magnetic field variations that were small but statistically significant, Chen noted in her technical report. The anomalies followed the exact path of the treeless line and extended approximately 50 feet on either side of the visible corridor. The pattern suggested a linear subsurface feature, possibly a mineral deposit or geological formation that might explain why vegetation won't grow in that area. Chen recommended additional geological surveys to identify the subsurface features causing the magnetic anomalies, but her research was terminated when federal funding for the project was redirected to other priorities. Her equipment was reassigned to mineral exploration studies in Colorado, and follow-up investigations of the Spruce Knob line were canceled without explanation. Local interest in the treeless corridor continued despite the end of official scientific study. Amateur historians and genealogical researchers investigating the connection to the planned Ohio town site discovered additional documentation suggesting that multiple railroad companies had considered routes through the Spruce Knob area during the mid-1800s. One particularly intriguing document, found in the archives of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, showed preliminary survey notes for a proposed mountain crossing that would have connected West Virginia coal fields directly to Ohio industrial centers. The notes included bearing calculations that matched the alignment of the Spruce Knob line, though no evidence existed that actual survey work had ever been conducted. Environmental groups monitoring forest health in the Monongahela National Forest began documenting the treeless line as an example of unexplained ecological phenomena that required protection from development or disturbance. Despite decades of observation, the corridor continued to resist all attempts at revegetation, maintaining its precise boundaries and refusing to support plant growth of any kind. Forest Service attempts to establish vegetation within the treeless zone consistently failed, even when using native plant species and optimal planting techniques. Seeds planted within the corridor would not germinate, and transplanted seedlings would wither and die within days, despite careful attention to soil preparation and watering schedules. Today, the treeless line remains exactly as Fire Tower observers first documented it 70 years ago, cutting through old-growth forest with geometric precision that seems impossible in a wilderness setting. The corridor continues to resist vegetation while surrounding forest thrives, creating a permanent scar across landscape that appears otherwise untouched by human activity. Hikers who discover the line while exploring the remote areas around Spruce Knob often report feeling disoriented when walking along the bare earth corridor, as if the normal reference points of forest environment disappear within the treeless zone. The silence within the corridor seems different from the quiet of surrounding forest, creating an acoustic environment that some visitors find unsettling. The line runs straight and true through wilderness that has never been surveyed, pointing toward a town that was never built, maintained by forces that leave no trace except the absence of life in soil that should support the same ancient forest that surrounds it. The trees know where not to grow, following instructions written in a language that predates the forest itself. The elevator button for the fourth floor was painted over decades ago, but visitors still press the space where it used to be. The Berkeley County Library occupies a 4-story brick building at the corner of King and Queen Streets in downtown Martinsburg, West Virginia, constructed in 1904, with funds provided by the Carnegie Foundation's Library Initiative. The building represents the classical revival architecture typical of Carnegie libraries, featuring limestone columns, arched windows, and ornate cornice work, designed to convey the dignity and permanence of public education. Martinsburg itself has served as Berkeley County's seat since 1772, when it was established as a way station along the Great Indian Warpath that connected Cherokee territories in the south with Iroquois lands to the north. The town's strategic location, at the convergence of several Native American trade routes, made it a natural center for commerce and communication, characteristics that persisted as European settlement expanded throughout the Shenandoah Valley. The library building was designed by Baltimore architect James Morrison to serve a community of approximately 8,000 residents, with space for 20,000 volumes, and reading areas that could accommodate up to 100 patrons simultaneously. Original construction documents show the building was planned with 4 floors, a basement for storage and mechanical systems, a ground floor for circulation and popular collections, a second floor for reference materials and periodicals, and a third floor for rare books and administrative offices. However, the original architectural blueprints filed with Berkeley County in 1904 show a 4th floor that was never mentioned in contemporary newspaper accounts of the library's construction or dedication. The blueprints indicate this floor was intended to house special collections and local history archives, with specifications for climate-controlled storage and specialized reading areas designed for researchers examining fragile documents. Local historians who have studied the library's construction found no evidence that the fourth floor was ever built or occupied. Yet the blueprints clearly show detailed plans for the space, including furniture layouts, electrical systems, and ventilation requirements. The discrepancy between the documented plans and the actual three-story structure has never been adequately explained by city officials or library administrators. The first documented reference to the library's mysterious fourth floor came from patron Margaret Whitley in September of 1957. Whitley had requested assistance locating genealogical records for her family's involvement in local Civil War activities, and librarian Dorothy Hanson directed her to check the local history collection upstairs on 4. Whitley later told the Martinsburg Journal that she had followed Hanson's directions and taken the main staircase to what she assumed would be the fourth floor, though she couldn't recall exactly how she had reached it. She described finding an extensive collection of local historical documents, including detailed accounts of Civil War battles that had never occurred in Berkeley County, but were described as if they had been major regional events. I found a whole section about the Battle of Opequon Creek Extension, which was supposed to have happened in 1864, Whitley said in her interview with the newspaper. The books had maps and casualty lists and everything, but I'd never heard of any battle with that name. When I tried to check the books out, the librarian downstairs said they didn't have any record of the titles I was asking about. Hanson, the librarian who had directed Whitley to the fourth floor, initially insisted that no such conversation had taken place. However, when pressed by Whitley and the newspaper reporter, Hanson admitted she had a vague recollection of giving directions to historical collections located upstairs, though she could not explain why she would have directed a patron to a floor that didn't exist. Similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency throughout the 1960s and 70s. Patrons would approach the circulation desk with books they claimed to have found upstairs or on 4, but library staff could find no record of the titles in their catalog system. The books invariably dealt with local historical events that bore no resemblance to actual Berkeley County history, yet were written with scholarly precision and extensive documentation. Head librarian Robert Chen, who served from 1968 to 1992, kept detailed records of these incidents after noticing patterns in the mysterious book requests. Chen documented over 40 instances when patrons claimed to have accessed materials from a fourth floor that library staff insisted did not exist. The books they described were always about local history, but they contained events that never happened, Chen wrote in his administrative notes. Civil War battles we'd never heard of, political scandals involving people who never lived here, natural disasters that weren't in any official records. But the patrons seemed genuinely convinced they had read these materials in our building. Chen also noted that several patrons provided call numbers for the books they claimed to have found, and these numbers consistently began with 4F, indicating a fourth floor location. The library's catalog system contained no call numbers beginning with 4F, and Chen confirmed that no such classification had ever been used in the building's 70-year history. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a historian at Shepherd University, became interested in the Berkeley County Library phenomenon while researching discrepancies in Civil War documentation. Rodriguez had heard rumors about patrons finding historical materials that contradicted established records, and she visited the library in October of 1983 to investigate. I asked to see their Civil War collection, and the staff member on duty directed me to the second floor, Rodriguez later recalled. But another patron who overheard my request said I should try upstairs on 4 if I wanted the really detailed battle accounts. When I asked the staff about a fourth floor, they looked at me like I was confused. Rodriguez examined the library building's architecture and confirmed that it appeared to be only 3 stories tall from both interior and exterior perspectives. However, she noticed that the building's proportions seemed unusual, as if there might be additional space between the third-floor ceiling and the roof that wasn't accounted for in the visible floor plan. The mystery deepened in 1985, when maintenance worker Carl Thompson reported finding a staircase that appeared to lead to a fourth floor, though he could never locate it again during subsequent visits to the building. Thompson had been replacing light fixtures in the third-floor administrative area when he noticed a door he had never seen before. "I opened the door and there was a staircase going up," Thompson said in his maintenance report. "I followed it up to what looked like another floor with bookshelves and reading tables. I was only there for maybe 5 minutes, looking around and trying to figure out why nobody had told me about this space. When I came back down and tried to find the door again, it wasn't there." Thompson's report prompted library administrators to conduct a comprehensive architectural survey of the building, comparing the current structure with the original 1904 blueprints. The survey confirmed that the building contained only 3 floors accessible to staff and patrons, with no evidence of concealed stairways or hidden spaces that might account for Thompson's experience. However, the architectural survey did reveal some unusual characteristics in the building's design. The ceiling height on the 3rd floor was significantly greater than indicated in the original blueprints, and there appeared to be approximately 8 feet of unaccounted space between the 3rd floor ceiling and the roof structure. City Building Inspector Michael Torres examined the space above the 3rd floor in 1986, accessing the area through a roof hatch typically used for mechanical maintenance. Torres reported that the space contained structural elements consistent with floor construction, including support beams, subflooring, and electrical conduits that appeared to have been installed during the original construction. "There's definitely a floor up there," Torres noted in his inspection report. "It looks like it was built to the same specifications as the rest of the building, with proper structural support and utility connections. But there's no access from the interior of the building, and I couldn't find any evidence that the space was ever finished or used." Torres also discovered several boxes of books stored in the unfinished 4th floor space, though he could not determine how they had been placed there or when. The books appeared to be bound volumes dealing with local historical topics, but Torres did not examine their contents in detail, and his report made no mention of their specific subjects or publication dates. Library administrators contacted the Berkeley County Historical Society to investigate the books Torres had found, but when Historical Society members attempted to access the space above the 3rd floor, they found the roof hatch secured with a new lock, and city officials declined to provide access. Subsequent requests to examine the 4th floor space were denied for safety reasons, and no further official investigation was conducted. The incidents involving phantom 4th floor visits continued, despite the official determination that no such floor existed. Library staff began keeping informal logs of patrons who asked about materials located upstairs or referenced call numbers beginning with 4F, noting that such requests occurred approximately once or twice per month. Many of these patrons appeared genuinely surprised when told that the library contained only 3 floors, insisting that they had personally visited reading areas and collections on a 4th level. Some provided detailed descriptions of the layout and contents of the mysterious floor, and their accounts showed remarkable consistency, despite coming from different individuals who claimed to have visited at various times. Local journalist Sandra Mills investigated the library mystery for a 1994 feature article in the Martinsburg Journal, interviewing dozens of patrons who claimed to have accessed the phantom 4th floor. Mills found that the patrons' descriptions of historical events they had read about upstairs consistently involved the same fictional battles, political figures, and natural disasters, as if they were all accessing the same alternate version of Berkeley County history. They weren't making up random stories, Mills wrote in her article. There was a coherent alternative history that multiple people were encountering, with dates and details that connected together into a complete narrative. It was like they were all reading from the same set of books that officially didn't exist. Mills attempted to access the library's architectural records to verify the building's original design specifications, but found that many documents from the 1904s had been lost or destroyed during various administrative transitions. The original blueprints were the only surviving documentation of the building's intended construction, and they clearly showed plans for a fourth floor that apparently was never built. Today, the Berkeley County Library continues operating as a three-story facility serving the educational and research needs of Martinsburg and surrounding communities. The building's fourth floor remains officially non-existent, though patrons still occasionally ask about collections located upstairs and reference call numbers that begin with 4F. Library staff have learned to politely redirect such inquiries to materials available on the three documented floors, though some veterans of the circulation desk admit they sometimes catch themselves looking upward when patrons ask about local historical resources, as if remembering directions to a place that isn't there. The space above the third-floor ceiling remains locked and inaccessible, holding whatever books or documents Carl Thompson discovered 40 years ago. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, when the library is nearly empty, staff members report hearing footsteps from overhead, the sound of someone walking slowly between shelves, of books that exist only in the memory of patrons who climbed stairs that were never built to read, histories that never happened. The bells ring underwater on schedule, marking time for services that ended 50 years before the lake was filled. Summersville Lake stretches across 2,800 acres of what was once the Gauley River Valley in Nicholas County, West Virginia, created when the Army Corps of Engineers completed Summersville Dam in 1966. The project was part of a comprehensive flood control and recreation development program designed to manage water flow throughout the Kanawha River system while providing economic opportunities for rural West Virginia communities. The dam stands 385 feet tall and 1,200 feet long, creating the largest lake in West Virginia and transforming a narrow river valley into a major recreational destination. The project required the relocation of several small communities, dozens of family farms, and numerous historical sites that would be permanently submerged beneath the rising waters. Among the most sensitive relocations was the Glade Creek Cemetery, established in 1847 to serve scattered farming communities throughout the valley. The cemetery contained over 400 graves, representing 5 generations of families who had settled along the Gauley River when the area was still considered frontier territory. Most burials dated from the mid-1800s through the 1950s, creating a comprehensive record of the valley's settlement and development. The Army Corps of Engineers followed standard protocols for cemetery relocation, carefully disinterring remains and transferring them to new burial sites on higher ground that would remain above the projected lake level. The process took 8 months to complete, with each grave individually excavated and relocated according to strict procedures designed to maintain the dignity and integrity of the burial sites. However, the Glade Creek Cemetery presented unique challenges due to its location and the nature of some burials. The cemetery occupied a hillside site overlooking the Gauley River, with graves arranged in terraced sections that followed the natural contours of the terrain. Some burials, particularly those from the 1800s, had been marked only with wooden crosses or fieldstone markers that had deteriorated over time, making precise identification difficult. The cemetery also contained the remains of Glade Creek Baptist Church, a small frame building constructed in 1852 that had served the scattered farming communities until a larger church was built in the county seat during the 1920s. The church building was demolished before the valley was flooded, but its bell tower and bronze bell were carefully preserved and relocated to the new cemetery site, along with the disinterred graves. Local fisherman Robert Hayes first reported unusual sonar readings at Summersville Lake in August of 1972, 6 years after the lake was filled to capacity. Hayes was using fish-finding sonar equipment to locate bass feeding areas when his depth finder began registering what appeared to be metallic objects moving at the lake bottom near the original location of Glade Creek Cemetery. The sonar was picking up something that looked like it was swinging back and forth about 80 feet down, Hayes told the Nicholas County Chronicle in a 1973 interview. It wasn't a fish or debris. The pattern was too regular, like a pendulum or something hanging and moving in the current. But there wasn't supposed to be anything down there except mud and old tree stumps. Hayes marked the GPS coordinates of his unusual sonar readings and returned to the area several times over the following weeks. Each visit produced similar results, with his equipment detecting rhythmic movement of metallic objects near the lake bottom. The objects appeared to be concentrated in an area that corresponded roughly to the former location of Glade Creek Cemetery, though all graves and structures were supposed to have been removed before flooding. Other fishermen began reporting similar sonar anomalies after Hayes shared his experience with members of the local bass fishing club. The reports showed remarkable consistency, with multiple anglers detecting the same rhythmic movements in the same general area of the lake. Most described the sonar signatures as resembling suspended metallic objects that moved with regular, predictable patterns. The phenomenon took on more disturbing characteristics in September of 1974, when fishing guide Dorothy Mills reported hearing what sounded like church bells ringing underwater while anchored near the former cemetery site. Mills was conducting an early morning fishing trip for out-of-state clients when she heard distinct bell tones coming from beneath the lake surface. It sounded exactly like the old church bell from Glade Creek Baptist, Mills later explained to local newspaper reporters. I grew up hearing that bell every Sunday morning before they tore the church down. The tone was unmistakable, even coming from underwater. But that bell was supposed to have been moved to the new cemetery up on the hill. Mills's clients, who were unfamiliar with the area's history, initially assumed the sounds were coming from some kind of underwater equipment or navigation system. However, Mills recognized the specific tone and rhythm of the Glade Creek church bell, which had called congregation members to worship services for over 70 years before the valley was flooded. Word of the underwater bells spread quickly through the small communities surrounding Summersville Lake, attracting curious visitors who hoped to experience the phenomenon firsthand. Many reported hearing the bells during early morning hours, particularly on Sundays when the lake was calm and ambient noise levels were lowest. Local historian Margaret Sutton became interested in the bell reports after realizing they seemed to correspond with historical records of funeral services held at Glade Creek Cemetery. Sutton had researched the cemetery's history as part of a genealogical project and maintained detailed records of burial dates and funeral arrangements spanning nearly a century. I started comparing the dates when people reported hearing the bells with the old funeral records, Sutton said in a 1976 interview. There was a pattern. The bells seemed to ring on the anniversary dates of funerals that had been held at the cemetery before it was moved. Not every funeral, but many of them, especially the older ones from the 1800s. Sutton's analysis revealed that the underwater bells followed the same schedule that had been used for funeral services at Glade Creek Baptist Church. The church had traditionally held burial services on weekday afternoons, with the bell tolling at specific intervals to announce the beginning of graveside ceremonies. The phantom bells appeared to be following this same pattern, ringing at the precise times when funeral services would have been conducted decades earlier. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, an acoustic engineer from West Virginia University, visited Summersville Lake in May of 1977 to investigate reports of the underwater bells. Rodriguez brought hydrophone equipment capable of detecting and recording sounds transmitted through water, hoping to document the phenomenon and determine its source. Rodriguez's initial recordings captured distinct bell tones, originating from approximately 80 feet below the lake surface, in an area that corresponded to the former location of Glade Creek Cemetery. The acoustic analysis revealed that the sounds matched the frequency profile of bronze bells, similar to those used in rural churches during the 19th century. The recordings definitely showed bell tones with characteristics consistent with a bronze church bell, Rodriguez noted in his technical report. However, we could not locate any physical source for the sounds. Underwater video surveys of the area revealed only lake bottom sediment and submerged tree stumps. No bell or other metallic objects were visible. Rodriguez also discovered that the phantom bells exhibited unusual acoustic properties that differed from normal underwater sound transmission. The bell tones appeared to originate from multiple points along the lake bottom, creating an effect similar to the way sound would carry across the hillside cemetery before the valley was flooded. The Army Corps of Engineers became aware of the Summersville Lake Bell reports when local media coverage attracted attention from regional newspapers and television stations. Corps officials maintained that all cemetery relocations had been conducted according to federal guidelines and that no graves or structures remained at the bottom of the lake. Colonel Patricia Chen, the Corps district engineer responsible for Summersville Dam operations, authorized a comprehensive survey of the submerged cemetery area in October of 1978. The survey team used side-scan sonar and underwater cameras to document conditions on the lake bottom and verify that no burial sites or structures had been inadvertently left behind during the relocation process. The Corps survey confirmed that the lake bottom in the former cemetery area contained no visible graves, building foundations, or large metallic objects that might account for the reported bell sounds. However, the survey did reveal several anomalies in the sediment patterns that suggested possible disturbances or subsurface features not visible in the underwater video documentation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a hydrologist working with the Corps survey team, noted unusual acoustic properties in the water column above the former cemetery site. Sound transmission measurements showed that certain frequencies resonated more strongly in that area of the lake, creating conditions that might amplify or focus underwater sounds in ways that could affect surface listeners. The water depth and bottom contours in that area create a kind of acoustic focusing effect, Martinez explained in her survey report. Sound waves of certain frequencies can be amplified and directed upward toward the surface, making underwater sounds more audible to people in boats or on the shore. However, Martinez's acoustic analysis could not explain the source of the sounds that were being amplified, and underwater searches continued to reveal no physical objects that might produce bell tones. The Corps survey concluded that while unusual acoustic conditions existed in the area, no evidence supported the presence of any submerged bells or other sound-producing devices. The Corps survey findings were filed in federal archives and received limited public distribution, though local residents continued to report hearing the underwater bells with the same frequency and timing patterns that had characterized the phenomenon since the early 1970s. The sounds appeared unaffected by the official determination that no physical source existed for the bell tones. Amateur researchers and local historians continued documenting the bell phenomenon, maintaining logs that tracked the correlation between reported sounds and historical funeral dates. The pattern remained consistent, with bells heard most frequently during anniversary weeks of burial services that had been conducted at the original cemetery. In 1985, genealogist Robert Thompson discovered records indicating that some graves at Glade Creek Cemetery might not have been successfully relocated during the Corps' cemetery removal project. Thompson found discrepancies between the number of graves documented in historical records and the number of remains that were officially transferred to the new cemetery site. The cemetery records showed 412 documented burials between 1847 and 1965. Thompson noted in his research summary. But the Corps relocation documentation accounted for only 378 successful transfers. There's a gap of 34 graves that aren't explained in the official records. Thompson's findings suggested that some burials, particularly older graves that lacked permanent markers, might have been missed during the relocation survey and remained at the bottom of Summersville Lake. However, when Thompson presented his research to Corps officials, he was told that all discrepancies had been accounted for and that no graves remained submerged. Today, fishermen and boaters at Summersville Lake continue reporting the sound of church bells ringing underwater, particularly during the anniversary weeks of funerals that were held at the original Glade Creek Cemetery. The bells follow the same schedule they maintained for over a century, calling no one to services that ended when the valley was flooded. Local fishing guides have learned to expect the phenomenon and often point out the area to curious visitors, though they rarely anchor directly over the former cemetery site during times when the bells are most likely to be heard. The sound carries across the water with the same clarity it once carried across the hillside, marking time that continues to pass beneath 80 feet of water. The bronze bell from Glade Creek Baptist Church sits silent in the relocated cemetery on higher ground, while its echo rings from the depths of Summersville Lake, calling the dead to services that continue in a sanctuary that exists only in the memory of water that refuses to forget what lies beneath. The blueprints were drawn with technical precision that wouldn't exist for another 70 years, signed by a man who had been dead for nearly a century. The New River Gorge Bridge spans 876 feet above the New River in Fayette County, West Virginia, connecting the communities of Fayetteville and Lansing across one of the deepest and most dramatic river canyons in the eastern United States. When completed in 1977, the Steel Arch Bridge became the longest single-arch bridge in the Western Hemisphere, and the third highest bridge in the United States, representing a significant achievement in modern civil engineering. The gorge itself was carved over millions of years by the New River, which, despite its name, is actually one of the oldest rivers on the North American continent. The river flows northward through ancient Appalachian rock formations, creating a canyon that reaches depths of over 1,000 feet in some areas. The challenging terrain had long prevented direct transportation connections between communities on opposite sides of the gorge, forcing travelers to follow winding routes that added hours to journeys that spanned only a few miles as the crow flies. Railroad engineers had grappled with crossing the New River Gorge since the late 1800s, when the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad built a series of bridges to carry coal trains through the canyon. The most significant of these was the New River Railroad Bridge, completed in 1892 as a massive steel truss structure that carried trains 400 feet above the river. The railroad bridge required innovative engineering techniques for its time and represented one of the most ambitious bridge construction projects undertaken in the Appalachian region during the industrial expansion of the late 19th century. The decision to build a modern highway bridge across the New River Gorge came in the early 1970s, when West Virginia transportation officials determined that a high-level crossing was necessary to complete the Appalachian Corridor highway system. The project would eliminate the need for traffic to descend into the gorge and climb back out on the opposite side, reducing travel times and improving access to the economically depressed region. Construction of the New River Gorge Bridge began in 1974, under the supervision of the West Virginia Department of Transportation and the American Bridge Division of United States Steel Corporation. The project required extensive engineering analysis to design a structure capable of spanning the gorge while withstanding the extreme wind conditions and seismic forces that characterize the canyon environment. The first indication that something unusual might be connected to the bridge construction came in August of 1977, when work crews were preparing to demolish portions of the old railroad bridge that would interfere with the new highway structure. Demolition supervisor Robert Chen was examining the railroad bridge's stone abutments when he noticed that one of the cornerstone blocks appeared to contain a sealed cavity. Chen reported the discovery to project engineers, who authorized careful removal of the cornerstone to examine its contents. Inside the sealed cavity, workers found a metal container holding what appeared to be architectural drawings and engineering calculations wrapped in oiled canvas to protect them from moisture. The drawings were remarkably well preserved, despite having been sealed in the cornerstone for 85 years. More significantly, the documents appeared to show detailed plans for a bridge that closely resembled the modern highway bridge, then under construction, complete with specifications for materials and construction techniques that had not been available when the railroad bridge was built in the 1890s. Project engineer Dorothy Mills examined the discovered drawings and found that they included precise calculations for wind load resistance, seismic stability, and traffic capacity that matched the engineering requirements for the new highway bridge. The plans showed a single-arch steel structure, with dimensions and proportions nearly identical to the bridge that American Bridge Division was constructing using the most advanced engineering techniques available in the 1970s. The drawings were incredibly detailed and technically accurate, Mills noted in her project report. They showed stress analysis calculations and material specifications that corresponded exactly to the requirements we had developed for the new bridge. But the techniques used in these calculations weren't developed until the 1940s and 50s. The most puzzling aspect of the discovered plans was the signature and date they bore. The drawings were signed by Thomas J. Whitmore and dated September 15, 1889. However, Mills' research into engineering records from the period revealed that Thomas J. Whitmore had been a civil engineer who worked on railroad bridge projects throughout West Virginia during the 1880s and had died in a construction accident on October 3, 1889, 18 days after the date on the mysterious bridge plans. Historical records showed that Whitmore had been involved in the design and construction of the original New River Railroad Bridge, serving as assistant engineer under the project's chief designer. Whitmore's professional papers, archived at the West Virginia University Library, contained numerous examples of his drafting style and engineering calculations, which matched the technical approach used in the discovered highway bridge plans. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a historian of engineering at Virginia Tech University, became interested in the Whitmore discovery when Mills contacted him for assistance in verifying the historical context of the found documents. Rodriguez had studied 19th century bridge construction extensively and was familiar with the technical limitations that constrained engineers working during that period. The calculations in Whitmore's drawings required knowledge of materials, science, and structural analysis that simply didn't exist in 1889, Rodriguez explained in his analysis of the documents. The stress analysis methods shown in these plans weren't developed until the 1920s, and some of the materials specifications referenced steel alloys that weren't available until after World War II. Rodriguez also noted that the drawings included provisions for vehicle traffic loads and safety standards that corresponded to 1970s highway design requirements, rather than the railroad loading standards that would have been relevant to an 1890s engineer. The plans anticipated automobile traffic patterns and weight distributions that Whitmore could not have known about in an era when horses and trains provided the primary means of transportation. The West Virginia Department of Transportation initially classified the Whitmore drawings as a historical curiosity and filed them with other project documentation, but interest in the discovery grew when construction workers reported additional anomalies related to the bridge project. Several workers claimed that construction had proceeded unusually smoothly in areas where the mysterious plans provided the most detailed guidance, as if the engineering challenges had been anticipated and solved decades in advance. Bridge construction foreman Carl Thompson noted that specific technical problems encountered during the project had been addressed by solutions that closely matched recommendations contained in the Whitmore drawings. "We ran into some unusual geological conditions on the South Side foundation work," Thompson said in a 1978 interview. "But when we checked those old drawings, they showed exactly the same problems and gave us solutions that worked perfectly." The engineering firm responsible for the bridge design, Michael Baker Jr. Corporation, conducted an internal review of the Whitmore documents to determine whether they might have any connection to the contemporary bridge project. The review confirmed that the discovered plans showed remarkable similarity to the actual bridge design, but concluded that the similarities were coincidental and that the historical documents had no bearing on the modern engineering work. However, Baker Corporation engineer Patricia Martinez noted several instances where the Whitmore drawings contained technical details that had not been included in the official bridge plans, but proved to be beneficial during construction. The old drawings showed some reinforcement details and foundation modifications that we hadn't originally specified, Martinez observed. When we encountered problems that made those modifications necessary, it was like someone had already solved the same issues 80 years earlier. Federal investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board examined the Whitmore documents in 1979 as part of a routine review of major bridge construction projects. The NTSB analysis confirmed the technical accuracy of the drawings and verified that they contained engineering solutions that corresponded to actual construction challenges encountered during the Highway Bridge project. The federal investigation also revealed that Thomas J. Whitmore had left behind extensive personal papers documenting his work on various railroad bridge projects throughout West Virginia and Pennsylvania. However, none of his archived materials contained any reference to highway bridge design or the advanced engineering techniques shown in the discovered drawings. NTSB investigator Dr. Sarah Chen noted that the Whitmore documents appeared to represent engineering knowledge that exceeded the technical capabilities available during the late 19th century. The drawings demonstrate mastery of structural analysis methods that weren't developed until decades after Whitmore's death. Chen wrote in her investigative summary, "The level of technical sophistication suggests access to engineering knowledge that wouldn't become available until the mid-20th century." The federal investigation file was subsequently classified and removed from public access when Chen's research revealed connections between the Whitmore drawings and other unexplained engineering documents found at historical construction sites throughout Appalachia. Chen was reassigned to other duties, and follow-up investigations of the bridge construction anomalies were suspended without explanation. Local historians continued researching the Thomas Whitmore mystery, despite the official end of federal interest in the case. Genealogical records confirmed that Whitmore had been born in 1857 and had received engineering training at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute before beginning his career with railroad construction companies operating in West Virginia. Whitmore's death in 1889 had occurred during construction of a railroad bridge across the Cheat River, when a cable snapped and caused scaffolding to collapse. Contemporary newspaper accounts described the accident as unexpected, noting that Whitmore had been inspecting completed work rather than participating in active construction when the fatal accident occurred. The New River Gorge Bridge was completed on schedule in October of 1977 and officially opened to traffic on October 22nd of that year. The bridge immediately became a major tourist attraction and engineering landmark, drawing visitors who marveled at its dramatic span across one of the most scenic canyons in the eastern United States. Today, the bridge carries thousands of vehicles daily across the New River Gorge, providing the direct transportation link that had been sought since the late 19th century. The structure has performed flawlessly since its completion, experiencing none of the settling or maintenance issues that sometimes affect major bridge projects during their first decades of service. The Thomas Whitmore drawings remain filed in West Virginia Department of Transportation archives, though access to the documents requires special permission that is rarely granted. Bridge maintenance inspectors occasionally consult the drawings when addressing unusual structural issues, finding that the 89-year-old plans continue to provide accurate guidance for maintaining a bridge that wouldn't be built for nearly another century. The mystery of how a 19th century engineer produced detailed plans for a 20th century bridge remains unsolved, filed away with the blueprints that continue to guide the maintenance of a structure that spans both the New River Gorge and the gap between what was possible in 1889 and what became necessary in 1977. The mail routes include addresses that lead to shadows of houses that were torn down before any of the current carriers were born. Lewisburg sits in the Greenbrier Valley of southeastern West Virginia, established in 1775 as the county seat of what would become Greenbrier County. The town developed around a courthouse and jail built at the intersection of two major colonial-era roads that connected Virginia settlements with frontier territories across the Appalachian Mountains. By the mid-1800s, Lewisburg had become a prosperous agricultural and commercial center, known for its mineral springs, educational institutions, and well-preserved antebellum architecture. The town's historic district contains over 60 buildings constructed between 1790 and 1910, creating one of the most complete examples of 19th-century Appalachian town development in West Virginia. Many of these structures have remained in continuous use for over 2 centuries, housing businesses, residences, and civic organizations that maintain the community's connection to its colonial and antebellum heritage. Lewisburg's postal service dates to 1807, when it was designated as an official post office serving scattered settlements throughout the Greenbrier Valley. The postal operation has occupied several different buildings over more than 2 centuries, but has maintained detailed records of mail routes and addresses that provide a comprehensive history of the town's residential and commercial development. The current post office building, constructed in 1938 as part of the Federal Works Progress Administration, serves approximately 4,000 residents within the Lewisburg city limits and surrounding rural areas. The building houses sorting facilities, administrative offices, and the route planning systems that coordinate daily mail delivery throughout the region. Mail carrier Dorothy Chen first documented unusual route instructions in her daily delivery sheets in March of 1994. Chen had worked the downtown Lewisburg route for 8 years and was familiar with every address within her assigned territory, which covered the historic district and several adjacent residential neighborhoods built during the early 1900s. On March 15th, Chen found handwritten additions to her official route sheet that directed her to deliver mail to 3 addresses she had never seen before. The instructions were written in blue ink in handwriting that differed from the usual notations made by postal supervisors, and the addresses were located on streets that Chen knew well, but at house numbers that didn't exist. The route sheet told me to deliver mail to 427 East Washington Street, but there's no 427 on that block, Chen later explained to postal investigators. The street only goes up to 415, and after that it's just an empty lot where they tore down an old house years ago. But I had mail addressed to someone at that number, so I drove over to see what was there. Chen found that the non-existent address corresponded to a vacant lot that had been empty since at least the 1980s, when the last residents moved away and the deteriorating house was demolished by the city. However, she noticed that the lot seemed to cast a shadow pattern at midday that suggested the presence of a large structure, despite no building occupying the space. The mail Chen was instructed to deliver was addressed to Harold Morrison, a name she didn't recognize. The envelope bore a return address from a law office in Charleston, West Virginia, and appeared to contain legal documents based on its weight and official appearance. Chen ultimately returned the mail to the post office as undeliverable, noting the address discrepancy in her incident report. Similar incidents occurred throughout the spring and summer of 1994, with Chen finding additional handwritten route instructions that directed her to non-existent addresses within her territory. The phantom addresses always corresponded to empty lots or spaces between existing buildings, and the mail was invariably addressed to recipients whose names didn't appear in current postal records. Chen began researching the names on the undeliverable mail and discovered that many corresponded to former Lewisburg residents who had died decades earlier. Harold Morrison, the recipient of the first mysterious delivery, had been a local merchant who died in 1963. His house on East Washington Street had been demolished in 1981 due to structural problems caused by foundation settling. Other phantom recipients included Margaret Whitley, who had operated a boarding house until her death in 1957, and Robert Thompson, a bank clerk who died in 1971. In each case, the addresses on the mysterious mail corresponded to locations where the deceased persons had actually lived, though the structures had long since been demolished or destroyed. Post Office Supervisor Michael Rodriguez became aware of the unusual route instructions when Chen submitted multiple incident reports documenting undeliverable mail to non-existent addresses. Rodriguez examined Chen's route sheets and confirmed that they contained handwritten additions that had not been made by any postal employee or supervisor. The handwriting was consistent across multiple route sheets, but none of our staff recognized it, Rodriguez noted in his administrative review. The writing appeared to be made with the same blue ink pen, and the additions were always placed in the appropriate sections of the route sheet, as if someone familiar with postal procedures had made the notations. Rodriguez also discovered that the phantom route instructions appeared on route sheets for other mail carriers working different territories within Lewisburg. Carriers Patricia Mills and Robert Hayes reported finding similar handwritten additions, directing them to addresses that didn't exist on their respective routes, always with mail addressed to people who had died years or decades earlier. The phenomenon attracted attention from postal investigators when Rodriguez reported the incidents to regional supervision offices in Charleston. Postal Inspector Dr. Sarah Martinez visited Lewisburg in September of 1994 to examine the unexplained route instructions and interview affected mail carriers. Martinez confirmed that the handwritten additions appeared on official route sheets, despite no authorization from postal supervisors or route planning departments. The handwriting showed consistent characteristics across multiple carriers' route sheets, suggesting that a single person had made all the unauthorized notations. The additions were made by someone with detailed knowledge of postal route procedures and local address systems, Martinez observed in her investigation report. The phantom addresses were structured correctly and placed appropriately within the established route sequences, indicating familiarity with mail delivery operations. Martinez also noted that the mysterious letters being delivered to non-existent addresses contained apparently legitimate correspondence from banks, law firms, and government agencies. The return addresses were genuine, and the mail appeared to be standard business communication rather than fraudulent or suspicious materials. However, when Martinez contacted the organizations that had supposedly sent mail to the phantom addresses, she discovered that none had any record of mailing correspondence to the deceased recipients. Banks denied sending documents to customers who had been dead for decades, and law firms had no files for clients whose estates had been settled years earlier. The United States Postal Service launched a comprehensive security investigation of the Lewisburg Post Office in October of 1994, examining all procedures and personnel involved in route planning and mail sorting operations. The investigation included interviews with current and former employees, analysis of handwriting samples, and review of security procedures designed to prevent unauthorized access to postal facilities. The security investigation revealed no evidence of unauthorized personnel gaining access to postal facilities or route planning systems. All current employees were cleared of involvement in creating the phantom route instructions, and handwriting analysis failed to match the mysterious blue ink notations with samples from any postal worker. Investigators also examined the vacant lots corresponding to the phantom addresses and confirmed that they cast shadow patterns inconsistent with their actual empty status. Professional surveyors hired by the Postal Service documented shadow measurements that suggested the presence of large structures at each location, despite clear visual evidence that no buildings existed. Dr. Patricia Chen, a surveyor specializing in historical property documentation, measured shadow patterns at 6 different phantom address locations during various times of day and seasons. Chen's measurements consistently indicated shadows cast by 2-story residential structures typical of late 19th century Lewisburg architecture. The shadow patterns were precisely what you would expect from houses built in the 1880s or 90s, Chen noted in her technical report. The measurements corresponded to typical roof lines, window placements, and architectural features common during that period. But there were no structures present to cast those shadows. Chen also researched historical records and confirmed that houses matching the shadow patterns had actually existed at each Phantom Address location. The structures had been built during Lewisburg's late 19th century expansion period and had remained occupied until various dates between the 1950s and 1980s, when they were demolished due to age, structural problems, or urban development projects. The Postal Service investigation concluded that the Phantom Route instructions represented an unexplained security breach that could not be attributed to any identifiable source. The case file was classified and forwarded to federal security agencies for further analysis, though no additional investigation was authorized. Local postal operations in Lewisburg returned to normal routine after the federal investigation ended, but mail carriers continued to report occasional Phantom Route instructions appearing on their daily sheets. The frequency decreased significantly after 1995, though carriers still occasionally found handwritten directions to non-existent addresses with mail for long-deceased recipients. Current Lewisburg Postal Supervisor Linda Carter, who began working at the post office in 2003, maintains files documenting ongoing incidents involving Phantom Route instructions. Carter estimates that such incidents occur approximately once or twice per year, always following the same pattern of handwritten additions, directing carriers to empty lots where former houses cast impossible shadows. "We've learned to expect it," Carter said in a 2020 interview. "When carriers find route instructions they don't recognize, we check the address against historical records. If it's one of the Phantom locations, we just mark the mail as undeliverable and file an incident report. There's no point trying to deliver mail to houses that aren't there anymore." The mail intended for deceased recipients is returned to senders who deny having mailed it, creating a circular bureaucracy that processes correspondence to people who can't receive it from organizations that didn't send it. The Phantom Route continues operating within official postal procedures, delivering memories to empty lots where shadows remember the houses that used to be. Today, mail carriers in Lewisburg still follow their assigned routes through a town where the past maintains its own postal service, addressing letters to residents who moved away permanently decades ago, but somehow remain on a delivery list that no living person wrote. The echo answers before the question is asked, repeating words that haven't been spoken yet with a voice that sounds almost, but not quite, like your own. The Beckley Limestone Quarry sits 3 miles southeast of the city limits in Raleigh County, West Virginia, carved into a hillside that contains some of the purest limestone deposits in the Central Appalachians. The quarry operated from 1928 to 1974, producing crushed stone for road construction and concrete manufacturing throughout the region. At its peak, the operation employed over 200 workers and extracted nearly 1 million tons of limestone annually from the expanding pit. The quarry was excavated in a series of stepped terraces that descended 200 feet into the hillside, creating an amphitheater-like depression surrounded by vertical rock walls. Heavy machinery worked the quarry floor in systematic patterns, blasting and removing limestone in layers that followed the natural geological stratification of the ancient seabed deposits. The operation left behind a geometric landscape of exposed rock faces, access roads, and settling ponds that created an artificial canyon in what had been rolling farmland. When limestone demand declined in the mid-1970s, the quarry company ceased operations and abandoned the site without conducting environmental remediation. The pit gradually filled with groundwater seepage, creating a deep lake surrounded by vertical limestone cliffs. The abandoned quarry became a popular but unofficial recreation area, attracting swimmers, rock climbers, and curiosity seekers who were drawn to the dramatic industrial landscape. Local safety officials posted warning signs around the quarry perimeter due to hazards from unstable rock faces and deep water. But the remote location made regular patrol and enforcement difficult. The site remained largely unmonitored, accessible by overgrown access roads that connected to rural routes used primarily by hunters and off-road vehicle enthusiasts. The first documented report of unusual acoustic properties at the Beckley Quarry came from geology student Robert Chen in April of 1987. Chen was conducting research on limestone formation patterns as part of his master's thesis at West Virginia University and had obtained permission to survey the abandoned quarry for geological samples and structural measurements. While working alone near the quarry rim, Chen noticed that sound seemed to behave strangely in the confined space created by the vertical rock walls. When he called out to test the acoustic properties of the pit, he heard what appeared to be an immediate response, followed by a normal, delayed echo several seconds later. I shouted, "Hello!" down into the quarry, and I heard, "Hello, come back right away." Then the regular echo about 3 seconds later, Chen wrote in his field notes. But the immediate response didn't sound quite right. It was my voice, but with a slightly different inflection, like someone else was saying the same word at exactly the same time. Chen repeated the experiment multiple times, using different words and phrases to test the acoustic phenomenon. In each case, he heard an immediate response that seemed to anticipate his voice, followed by the expected delayed echo that reflected off the quarry walls. The immediate response always contained the exact words he intended to speak, but with subtle variations in pronunciation and emphasis. Chen documented the experience in his research journal, but initially attributed the phenomenon to unusual acoustic properties created by the quarry's geometric shape and limestone composition. However, he found no scientific literature describing similar immediate echo effects in comparable environments. Word of the quarry's strange acoustic properties spread through the West Virginia University Geology Department, attracting other students and faculty who visited the site to experience the phenomenon firsthand. Dr. Patricia Martinez, a professor specializing in acoustic geology, organized a field trip to the quarry in September of 1987 to document and analyze the unusual sound behavior. Martinez brought professional recording equipment to capture the acoustic anomalies that students had reported. Her team recorded multiple instances of the immediate echo effect, confirming that visitors' voices were somehow returned instantaneously before the normal echo arrived from the quarry walls. We documented clear evidence of sound being returned faster than physically possible, Martinez noted in her research report. Sound waves traveling at 340 meters per second should take approximately 1.2 seconds to travel to the quarry floor and back. But we were recording return sound with zero delay, suggesting that somehow the quarry was anticipating and repeating sounds before they were completely vocalized. Acoustic analysis of Martinez's recordings revealed that the immediate echoes contained subtle but measurable differences from the original vocalizations. The return sounds showed variations in pitch, timing, and vocal characteristics that suggested they were not simple reflections of the speaker's voices. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, an acoustic engineer from Virginia Tech University, became interested in the Beckley Quarry phenomenon after reading Martinez's preliminary research findings. Rodriguez specialized in architectural acoustics and had experience analyzing unusual sound behavior in constructed environments. Rodriguez visited the quarry in November of 1987 with sophisticated acoustic monitoring equipment designed to measure sound propagation and reflection patterns. His analysis confirmed the presence of immediate sound returns that preceded normal echo responses by several seconds. The immediate returns showed frequency patterns that matched the intended vocalizations, but with harmonic variations that suggested acoustic processing or modification, Rodriguez wrote in his technical analysis. The effect was consistent across multiple speakers and vocal patterns, but the modifications were unique to each individual voice. Rodriguez also discovered that the immediate echo effect was most pronounced when speakers used specific words or phrases, particularly those containing hard consonants or dramatic inflections. Simple sounds like clapping or whistling produced normal echo responses, while complex vocalizations consistently triggered the anomalous immediate returns. Local residents living near the quarry began reporting their own experiences with the acoustic phenomenon after newspaper coverage of the university research attracted regional attention. Many described visiting the quarry out of curiosity and experiencing the unsettling effect of hearing their own voices returned with subtle but noticeable differences. Margaret Whitley, who lived on a farm adjacent to the quarry property, had heard strange sounds coming from the abandoned pit for several years, but had never investigated their source. After reading about the research being conducted at the site, she visited the quarry and experienced the immediate echo effect firsthand. "I called out, 'Anybody there?' and heard it come right back, but it sounded like someone else was asking the question at the same time." Whitley told a reporter from the Beckley Register-Herald in January of 1988, "It gave me chills because it was my voice, but somehow not my voice. Like someone was copying what I was going to say before I finished saying it." Other local visitors reported similar experiences, describing the immediate echoes as containing emotional inflections or emphasis patterns that differed from their intended vocalizations. Some found the phenomenon entertaining, while others described feeling disturbed by hearing their own voices returned with subtle modifications that suggested conscious interpretation or response. The growing public interest in the quarry's acoustic properties attracted attention from the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey, which dispatched investigators to assess potential safety hazards at the abandoned industrial site. The state investigation focused primarily on structural stability and water quality issues, but also documented the acoustic anomalies that had been reported by researchers and visitors. State geologist Dr. Sarah Chen conducted a comprehensive survey of the quarry in March of 1988 using ground-penetrating radar and seismic analysis equipment to examine the subsurface geology that might account for the unusual acoustic effects. Chen's investigation revealed complex limestone cave systems extending beneath the quarry floor, creating a network of natural acoustic chambers that could potentially influence sound behavior. The limestone formation contains extensive solution cavities and underground passages that create a three-dimensional acoustic environment, Chen noted in her geological survey report. Sound waves entering this system could potentially be reflected, modified, and returned through pathways that don't correspond to simple geometric reflection patterns. However, Chen's seismic analysis could not explain how sound waves would be returned faster than the speed of sound would allow, even accounting for complex underground reflection pathways. The immediate echo effect appeared to violate basic principles of acoustic physics, suggesting that factors beyond normal sound propagation might be involved. The state investigation also revealed that the quarry site contained several features not documented in original mining records. Subsurface surveys detected artificial chambers and constructed passages that appeared to predate the limestone extraction operations, suggesting that the quarry had been excavated around existing underground structures. Historical research, conducted by the State Archaeological Office, revealed that the quarry site had been used by Cherokee hunting parties during the 18th century, who considered the location to be spiritually significant due to unusual acoustic properties that allowed communication with ancestral voices. Cherokee oral traditions describe the site as a place where words spoken into the earth would be returned with guidance from those who had passed on. Federal interest in the Beckley Quarry phenomenon began when the National Institute of Standards and Technology received reports about acoustic effects that appeared to exceed the speed of sound. NIST dispatched a research team in June of 1988 to conduct precise measurements of the immediate echo effect using equipment capable of detecting nanosecond timing variations. The federal investigation confirmed the existence of sound returns that preceded normal acoustic propagation by measurable intervals, but could not identify any physical mechanism that would account for such behavior. NIST researchers noted that the phenomenon appeared to violate fundamental laws of physics while remaining consistently reproducible under controlled experimental conditions. Dr. Linda Carter, the NIST team leader, documented over 40 instances of immediate sound returns during the 3-week investigation period. Carter's measurements showed that the acoustic anomaly occurred regardless of atmospheric conditions, speaker characteristics, or equipment configurations, suggesting that the effect was inherent to the quarry environment rather than dependent on external variables. We observed acoustic phenomena that challenge our understanding of sound propagation and wave physics, Carter wrote in her preliminary findings report. The immediate returns appear to contain information that should not be available until after the complete vocalization is transmitted and processed. The NIST investigation was terminated abruptly when Carter's research team was reassigned to other projects without explanation. The quarry investigation files were classified and removed from public access, and follow-up requests for information were referred to federal security agencies that declined to comment on the research findings. Local interest in the quarry's acoustic properties continued, despite the end of official scientific investigation. Amateur acoustic researchers and curiosity seekers maintained informal documentation of the immediate echo effect, sharing recordings and experiences through word-of-mouth networks that preserved knowledge of the phenomenon. Today, the Beckley Quarry remains abandoned and officially off-limits to public access, though warning signs posted around the perimeter have weathered and become difficult to read. Visitors still occasionally experience the immediate echo effect, hearing their own voices return from the limestone depths with subtle modifications that suggest conscious interpretation rather than simple acoustic reflection. The quarry continues to answer questions before they are completely asked, returning words with inflections that somehow improve upon the original intention. Those who visit the site often find themselves hesitating before speaking, uncertain whether they want to hear how their own voice sounds when someone else decides how it should be spoken. The visitors sign their names and describe places that aren't on any map, leaving detailed accounts of trails that lead to waterfalls no ranger has ever seen. Blackwater Falls State Park encompasses 2,600 acres of rugged mountain terrain in Tucker County, West Virginia, centered around the dramatic 62-foot waterfall where the Blackwater River plunges over sandstone cliffs into a deep canyon below. The park was established in 1937 as one of West Virginia's first state parks, preserving a landscape of ancient forests, rocky gorges, and high-elevation wetlands that represent some of the most pristine wilderness remaining in the central Appalachians. The Blackwater River derives its name from the dark, tea-colored water that results from tannins leached from hemlock and spruce needles in the surrounding forest. The river flows through a landscape shaped by millions of years of erosion, carving deep gorges through layers of sedimentary rock that tell the geological history of the region. The falls themselves were formed when the river encountered a resistant layer of sandstone that created the vertical drop, now considered one of the most photographed natural features in West Virginia. The park's trail system encompasses over 20 miles of marked hiking paths that wind through diverse ecosystems ranging from high-elevation spruce forests to rhododendron-filled valleys. The main trails connect key attractions, including the falls overlooks, Ellicala Falls, Balanced Rock, and various scenic vistas that provide views across the Blackwater Canyon and surrounding Allegheny Mountains. Park facilities include a visitor center constructed in 1968 that houses interpretive displays, administrative offices, and the guest registration system used to track visitor attendance and collect feedback about park experiences. The registration book serves as both a safety measure for tracking hikers and a source of information about visitor satisfaction and suggestions for park improvements. The first unusual entries in the Blackwater Falls visitor log were noted by Park Ranger Dorothy Chen in May of 1992. While reviewing guest comments as part of routine administrative duties, Chen noticed several visitors had described hiking to waterfalls and scenic overlooks that she didn't recognize from her 8 years of experience working in the park. One entry, signed by Robert and Margaret Whitley from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, described hiking the Upper Canyon Trail to view Thunder Falls. A waterfall, they claimed, was even more spectacular than the main Blackwater Falls. The Whitleys provided detailed directions to the location, including landmarks such as a distinctive rock formation they called Eagle's Perch, and a wooden bridge crossing that they said was marked with trail signs, indicating a distance of 2.4 miles from the visitor center. Chen was familiar with every official trail in the park and knew that no Upper Canyon Trail existed in the park's trail system. The described route would have led into undeveloped wilderness areas that were closed to public access due to steep terrain and unstable rock formations. There was no waterfall matching the description of Thunder Falls anywhere within the park boundaries. I thought maybe they were confused about which park they had visited, Chen later explained to park supervisors. But their description of the starting point and the other landmarks they mentioned were definitely from Blackwater Falls. They just described finding trails and waterfalls that aren't there. Chen began paying closer attention to visitor log entries and discovered that similar reports occurred approximately once or twice per month throughout the hiking season. Visitors consistently described accessing trails and viewing natural features that didn't correspond to any known locations within the park, yet their accounts included enough accurate details about legitimate park features to confirm they had actually visited Blackwater Falls. The Phantom Trail descriptions showed remarkable consistency across different visitors who appeared to have no connection to each other. Multiple groups independently described the same Upper Canyon Trail, Thunder Falls, and Eagle's Perch rock formation, providing similar distance estimates and landmark references that suggested they were all accessing the same non-existent locations. Park Superintendent Michael Rodriguez became aware of the unusual visitor log entries when Chen brought them to his attention during a staff meeting in September of 1992. Rodriguez had managed Blackwater Falls for 12 years and was intimately familiar with every trail, waterfall, and scenic feature within the park boundaries. Rodriguez examined the questionable visitor log entries and confirmed that they described locations that didn't exist in the park. However, he also noted that the descriptions were geographically plausible, referencing terrain features and ecological characteristics that were consistent with the park's environment and would be accurate for the areas where the Phantom Trails were supposedly located. The descriptions weren't random or obviously fabricated, Rodriguez observed in his administrative notes. They showed knowledge of local geology, plant communities, and wildlife that would be accurate for someone who had actually hiked in this area. But they were describing places that we've never developed trails to reach. Rodriguez decided to investigate the matter personally and attempted to locate the areas described in the visitor log entries. Using the directions provided by various visitors, he hiked into the undeveloped sections of the park where the Phantom Trails were supposedly located, but found only unmarked wilderness, with no evidence of trail development or regular human access. Dr. Patricia Martinez, a recreational geographer from West Virginia University, became interested in the Blackwater Falls phenomenon after Rodriguez mentioned the unusual visitor reports during a conference on park management. Martinez specialized in analyzing visitor experiences and trail usage patterns, and was curious about how visitors might be accessing undeveloped areas of the park. Martinez visited Blackwater Falls in October of 1993 and spent several days reviewing the visitor log entries that described Phantom Trails and waterfalls. She noted that the reports included specific GPS coordinates, detailed hiking times, and technical descriptions of rock formations that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of the park's geography and geology. The level of detail in these reports was remarkable, Martinez wrote in her research notes. Visitors were providing precise coordinates, accurate botanical observations, and detailed descriptions of geological features. This wasn't casual sightseeing. These people were conducting serious exploration and documentation of areas that supposedly don't have public access. Martinez attempted to verify some of the GPS coordinates provided by visitors who claimed to have reached phantom locations within the park. The coordinates consistently placed the described features in areas that were either undeveloped wilderness or completely outside the park boundaries, yet the landmark references and access descriptions clearly indicated starting points within the established trail system. Local hiking guide Robert Thompson, who had been leading groups through Blackwater Falls for over 20 years, became aware of the Phantom Trail reports. When several of his clients mentioned wanting to visit waterfalls they had read about in the park's visitor log. Thompson was familiar with every waterfall, overlook, and trail junction in the area, but couldn't identify the locations his clients were asking about. People would come to me with these detailed descriptions they'd copied from the visitor book, Thompson said in a 1994 interview. They'd ask me to take them to Thunder Falls or Eagle's Perch, and I'd have to tell them that those places don't exist. But they had GPS coordinates and everything, like they were real destinations. Thompson decided to investigate some of the phantom locations himself, using the detailed directions provided in visitor log entries to guide his exploration of undeveloped areas within and adjacent to the park. Despite his extensive knowledge of the local terrain, Thompson was unable to locate any of the waterfalls, rock formations, or scenic overlooks described by previous visitors. Thompson also noted that some of the Phantom Trail descriptions included references to park infrastructure that didn't exist, such as trail markers, wooden bridges, and interpretive signs that would have required official park development and maintenance. The described infrastructure was always appropriate and professionally designed, but none of it could be found at the specified locations. The West Virginia Division of Natural Resources launched an investigation into the Blackwater Falls visitor log discrepancies in March of 1995. Concerned that visitors might be accessing dangerous areas outside established park boundaries, or that unofficial trails might have been created without proper authorization, State Park Inspector Dr. Sarah Chen conducted a comprehensive survey of all undeveloped areas within Blackwater Falls State Park, using helicopter reconnaissance and ground teams to document any unauthorized trail development or evidence of regular visitor access. The investigation revealed no unauthorized trails, infrastructure, or signs of regular human activity in the areas where phantom locations were supposedly located. Chen's team also attempted to contact visitors who had signed the log entries, describing phantom trails and waterfalls, hoping to interview them about their park experiences and clarify the locations they had actually visited. However, attempts to reach the visitors using the contact information provided in their log entries consistently failed, with most phone numbers and addresses proving to be incorrect or non-existent. We tried to contact over 30 visitors who had described phantom locations in their log entries, Chen noted in her investigation report. In every case, the contact information they provided was either invalid or led to people who denied ever visiting Blackwater Falls State Park. It was like the log entries had been made by people who didn't actually exist. The state investigation also revealed that the handwriting in phantom location log entries showed unusual consistency across supposedly different visitors, suggesting that a single person might have been responsible for multiple fraudulent entries. However, handwriting analysis was inconclusive, and no motive could be identified for creating false visitor accounts. Federal interest in the Blackwater Falls phenomenon developed when the National Park Service received reports that visitors were describing locations that appeared to extend beyond state park boundaries into adjacent national forest land. The Forest Service was concerned that unauthorized recreational activity might be occurring in sensitive wilderness areas that were closed to public access. Dr. Linda Carter, a recreational ecologist with the Forest Service, investigated the phantom location reports in June of 1996. focusing on whether the described areas might actually exist in adjacent Monongahela National Forest land rather than within the state park boundaries. Carter's analysis revealed that some of the GPS coordinates provided by visitors did correspond to real geographical features within the national forest, but these areas were designated wilderness, where trail development was prohibited. Carter's investigation also discovered that several of the phantom waterfalls described in visitor log entries did correspond to actual seasonal waterfalls that formed during periods of heavy precipitation in remote areas of the national forest. However, these locations were not accessible by any established trails and would require technical climbing skills to reach safely. The phantom locations weren't completely fictional, Carter observed in her research summary. Many of them described real geographical features that exist in the area, but in locations that are either inaccessible to casual hikers or closed to public recreation. It was like someone with extensive local knowledge was describing real places, but claiming they could be reached through non-existent trails. The federal investigation was terminated when Carter's research team was reassigned to other projects, and the case files were classified under regulations protecting sensitive wilderness area information. Subsequent inquiries about the investigation were referred to federal security agencies that declined to provide information about their findings. Today, the visitor log at Blackwater Falls State Park continues to receive occasional entries describing phantom trails and waterfalls that don't appear on any official map. Park staff have learned to recognize these reports and quietly note them without taking official action, treating them as unexplained curiosities rather than legitimate visitor feedback. Current Park Superintendent Margaret Dotson estimates that phantom location reports occur 3 or 4 times per year, always during peak hiking seasons when the park receives the most visitors. The reports maintain their consistent pattern of detailed descriptions, precise coordinates, and technical accuracy about geological and ecological features. We still get people asking about Thunder Falls or wanting directions to Eagle's Perch, Dotson said in a 2020 interview. I tell them those aren't official park destinations, but some visitors insist they've read detailed accounts in our visitor log. When I check the log, sure enough, there are new entries describing places that don't exist on our trail maps. The phantom visitors continue leaving their signatures and detailed accounts, describing waterfalls that cascade through wilderness, accessible only through trails that were never built, maintained by a park service that exists parallel to reality, but slightly to the left of any map that can be officially verified or followed. The conductor calls out destinations that haven't existed for 90 years, announcing the arrival of a train that never comes to a platform where commuters wait for different rails entirely. Harpers Ferry occupies a dramatic confluence where the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers meet, creating the natural transportation corridor that made the town a crucial railroad junction from the 1830s through the mid-20th century. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad established its first station at Harpers Ferry in 1834, taking advantage of the water gap through the Blue Ridge Mountains that provided the easiest route for trains traveling between the Chesapeake Bay and the Ohio River Valley. The town became one of the most important railroad centers in the eastern United States, serving as a division point where multiple rail lines converged and diverged toward destinations throughout Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia. At its peak, in the early 1900s, Harpers Ferry processed over 50 passenger trains daily, connecting small mountain communities with major cities from Baltimore to Cincinnati. The original Baltimore and Ohio passenger station was a substantial brick structure built in 1894 to handle the heavy traffic that made Harpers Ferry a vital link in the national transportation network. The station served not only B/O trains, but also connecting lines that reached deep into the Appalachian coalfields and rural communities that depended on rail service for both passenger and freight transportation. Railroad operations at Harpers Ferry began declining in the 1920s as automobile travel increased and branch line passenger service became economically unsustainable. Many of the small towns served by connecting railroads lost their passenger service during the Great Depression, when railroad companies abandoned routes that could no longer generate sufficient revenue to justify continued operation. The last Baltimore and Ohio passenger train stopped at Harper's Ferry in 1958, ending over a century of continuous rail passenger service. The old station building was demolished in 1962, and the site remained vacant until the modern MARC commuter rail service established a new platform in 1984 to serve passengers traveling between West Virginia and the Washington metropolitan area. Morning commuter Robert Chen first reported hearing phantom train sounds at the Harper's Ferry MARC station in October of 1997. Chen had been using the commuter service for 3 years to travel to his job in Washington, and was familiar with the normal sounds and schedule of the modern electric trains that served the route. While waiting for the 7:15 MARC train on October 23rd, Chen heard what sounded like a steam locomotive approaching the station at exactly 6:47 in the morning. The sounds included the distinctive whistle, hissing steam, and screeching brakes associated with older railroad technology, followed by what appeared to be the mechanical sounds of passenger car doors opening and closing. I heard this old-fashioned train whistle, then the sound of a heavy locomotive pulling into the station, Chen later told MARC officials. There were brake sounds, steam hissing, all the noises you'd expect from an old steam train. Then I heard doors opening and a conductor calling out, "Station stops." But there was no train there. The platform was empty, except for me and a few other commuters. Chen reported that the phantom conductor announced stops for towns he had never heard of, including Millville Junction, Kearneysville Crossing, and Shepherdstown Branch. The announcement concluded with a destination that Chen remembered as Martinsburg via the Valley Line, though he knew that no such routing had ever been part of the local rail system. The phantom train sounds lasted approximately 5 minutes before fading away, leaving the platform silent except for normal morning sounds from the nearby rivers and surrounding forest. Chen's fellow commuters appeared not to have heard anything unusual, and when Chen mentioned the incident, they suggested he might have heard sounds from freight trains operating on distant tracks. Similar reports began accumulating from other MARC commuters who used the early morning service from Harper's Ferry. The phantom train sounds occurred exclusively at 6:47 in the morning, following the same pattern of steam locomotive arrival, door opening sounds, and conductor announcements for obsolete destinations. Dorothy Mills, who had commuted from Harper's Ferry since the MARC service began, started paying attention to the phantom train phenomenon after Chen's report was mentioned in a local newspaper article. Mills confirmed that she had occasionally heard unusual train sounds that didn't correspond to any scheduled MARC service, though she had previously attributed them to freight trains or maintenance activities. I'd heard strange train sounds before, but I never really thought about it until I read about what Robert Chen experienced, Mills said in a 1998 interview. Once I started listening carefully, I realized that the sounds came at exactly the same time every morning, and they definitely weren't from any modern train. Mills began documenting the phantom conductor announcements and discovered that they consistently included stops for towns that had lost rail service decades earlier. Research at the Jefferson County Historical Society revealed that many of the announced destinations had indeed been served by Baltimore and Ohio branch lines that were discontinued between 1925 and 1935. However, Mills also noted that the phantom announcements always concluded with destinations that appeared in no historical railroad records. Martinsburg, via the Valley Line, was the most common final destination, though no Valley Line had ever connected Harper's Ferry with Martinsburg through the route that would be implied by such a designation. Local historian Dr. Michael Rodriguez became interested in the phantom train phenomenon when Mills contacted him for assistance researching the historical context of the conductor announcements. Rodriguez had studied railroad history in the Shenandoah Valley extensively and was familiar with the various branch lines and connecting services that had operated in the region during the early 20th century. Rodriguez confirmed that most of the stops announced by the Phantom Conductor corresponded to actual stations that had been served by Baltimore and Ohio branch lines before the Great Depression. The announcements followed the correct geographical sequence that trains would have used when traveling from Harper's Ferry toward various destinations in the northern Shenandoah Valley. The conductor was announcing a legitimate train route that had operated in the 1920s, Rodriguez observed in his research notes. But he was also including stops and destinations that never existed, as if the Phantom train was serving an expanded version of the historical rail network that was never actually built. Rodriguez's investigation revealed that railroad companies had indeed proposed several additional branch lines and connecting services in the Shenandoah Valley during the 1910s and 20s, but these routes were never constructed due to financial constraints and declining passenger demand. The Phantom announcements appeared to include stops that would have been served by these proposed but never built railroad extensions. The Maryland Rail Commuter Service became officially aware of the Phantom train reports when multiple passengers submitted complaints about confusing announcements that didn't correspond to MARC schedules or destinations. MARC officials initially assumed the reports referred to public address system malfunctions or interference from other radio communications. However, when MARC technicians investigated the reports, they found that the station's public address system was not operational during the times when Phantom announcements were reported. The PA equipment was programmed to activate only when scheduled MARC trains were approaching the station, and no trains were scheduled to arrive at 6:47 in the morning. Dr. Patricia Martinez, an acoustic engineer contracted by MARC to investigate the Phantom sounds, visited Harper's Ferry in March of 1999 to document and analyze the reported audio phenomena. Martinez brought professional recording equipment and spent 5 consecutive mornings monitoring the station platform during the time period when Phantom train sounds were most commonly reported. On her third morning of observation, Martinez successfully recorded the Phantom train sounds, including steam locomotive noises, brake sounds, and conductor announcements, that matched the descriptions provided by commuters. Acoustic analysis revealed that the sounds exhibited frequency characteristics consistent with steam-era railroad equipment rather than modern electric trains. The recordings definitely captured sounds consistent with 1920s or 30s railroad operations, Martinez noted in her technical report. The locomotive whistle showed harmonic patterns typical of steam whistles, and the mechanical sounds matched the characteristics of older passenger car door systems. But there was no visible source for these sounds. Martinez also discovered that the Phantom conductor's voice showed acoustic properties suggesting the announcements were being made through period-appropriate public address equipment with the slight distortion and frequency limitations typical of early electric amplification systems. The voice patterns and pronunciation matched speech characteristics documented in historical recordings of railroad personnel from the 1920s and 30s. Federal interest in the Harper's Ferry phenomenon developed when the Federal Railroad Administration received reports about Phantom train operations that might interfere with modern rail safety systems. FRA investigators were concerned that unexplained audio phenomena might confuse train crews or passengers using the active MARC commuter service. Dr. Sarah Chen, an FRA safety specialist, conducted a comprehensive investigation of the Harper's Ferry station in June of 1999, examining all electronic systems and communication equipment that might produce phantom audio signals. Chen's investigation revealed no equipment malfunctions or external interference sources that could account for the reported Phantom train sounds. Chen also analyzed the historical railroad operations that had used the original Harper's Ferry station, comparing the Phantom conductor announcements with actual Baltimore and Ohio timetables from the 1920s and 30s. She found that the announced stops and routing corresponded closely to actual BO branch line services, with the addition of several destinations that had been proposed but never implemented. The phantom announcements were historically accurate for the most part, Chen wrote in her investigation summary. They reflected actual railroad operations that had served this area 70 years ago. The anomalous element was the inclusion of destinations that were planned but never built, as if the phantom train was operating on a more complete version of the rail network than had actually existed. The FRA investigation was classified when Chen's research revealed connections between the phantom train phenomenon and other unexplained transportation anomalies reported at historical railroad sites throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Chen was reassigned to other duties, and follow-up investigations of the Harper's Ferry case were suspended without explanation. Local commuters continued reporting phantom train sounds despite the conclusion of official investigations. The phenomenon maintained its precise 6:47 timing and consistent pattern of conductor announcements, becoming a familiar but unexplained aspect of the morning routine for MARC passengers who used the early service from Harper's Ferry. Current MARC station attendant Linda Thompson, who has worked at Harper's Ferry since 2005, estimates that phantom train sounds are reported by passengers approximately once or twice per month, always during the peak commuting season when the station sees its heaviest use. Regular commuters know about it, and they just wait for it to finish before the real train arrives, Thompson said in a 2020 interview. New passengers sometimes get confused and think they've missed their train, but we explain that it's just something that happens here. Nobody really knows why. Today, the phantom conductor continues his morning announcements, calling out stops for towns that lost their train service during the Great Depression and destinations that were never served by any railroad. The invisible train maintains its schedule with punctuality that modern transit systems rarely match, arriving precisely at 6:47 each morning to collect passengers who departed decades ago for places that exist only in the memory of rails that were never laid. The weather station records ideal growing conditions for plants that have never been cataloged by science in soil that contains their roots but not their leaves. Dolly Sod's wilderness encompasses 10,200 acres of high-elevation plateau in the Monongahela National Forest of eastern West Virginia, representing one of the most unique ecosystems in the Central Appalachians. The area sits at elevations between 2,500 and 4,000 feet, creating environmental conditions more typical of northern Canada than the Mid-Atlantic region. Ancient sandstone formations and acidic soils support plant communities that include cranberries, sphagnum moss, and stunted spruce trees that form a boreal landscape isolated hundreds of miles south of its normal range. The wilderness area takes its name from an 18th-century German homesteader named Dahle, whose family established one of the first European settlements in the remote mountain region. Sods refers to the grassy meadows and bog communities that characterize much of the plateau, creating a landscape that early visitors described as resembling the Scottish Highlands or Scandinavian tundra. Dolly Sods has been shaped by both natural forces and human activity over the past century and a half. During World War II, the area was used as an artillery training range and bombing practice site, leaving behind unexploded ordnance that still occasionally surfaces in the wilderness. The military activity, combined with logging operations and periodic wildfires, created the current mosaic of open meadows, scattered forest, and unique plant communities that make Dolly Sods unlike any other ecosystem in West Virginia. The Forest Service established an automated weather monitoring station in the central portion of Dolly Sods in 1991 to collect data on the unusual climatic conditions that support the area's distinctive plant-animal communities. The station was positioned in an open meadow approximately 2 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trails that wind through the rugged terrain of the wilderness area. Forest Service meteorologist Robert Chen was responsible for maintaining the Dolly Sods weather station and analyzing the environmental data it collected. Chen visited the remote site quarterly to download data, calibrate instruments, and perform routine maintenance on the solar-powered monitoring equipment that recorded temperature, humidity, precipitation, wind speed, and soil conditions 24 hours a day. In September of 1994, Chen noticed unusual patterns in the data collected by the Dolly Sod station during his routine quarterly review. The temperature and humidity readings showed microclimatic conditions that differed significantly from measurements recorded at other high-elevation sites throughout the Monongahela National Forest, despite similar topographic and exposure characteristics. The station was recording temperature and humidity combinations that seemed too specific and consistent to be natural variations, Chen noted in his maintenance log. The readings suggested growing conditions that would be ideal for particular plant species, but not the vegetation communities we actually observe in that area. Chen's analysis revealed that the station consistently recorded temperature ranges between 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity levels maintaining precisely 55 to 60%, regardless of seasonal variations or weather patterns affecting the broader region. These conditions persisted through winter months, when temperatures at comparable elevations typically dropped well below freezing. The microclimate data suggested environmental conditions that would support temperate plant species requiring consistent moisture and moderate temperatures year-round. However, the actual vegetation surrounding the weather station consisted of typical Dolly Sods plant communities adapted to harsh mountain conditions, including low-growing shrubs, hardy grasses, and scattered evergreen trees that showed no evidence of the favorable growing conditions indicated by the monitoring equipment. Chen initially suspected equipment malfunction and replaced all temperature and humidity sensors during his December 1994 maintenance visit. However, subsequent data downloads continued to show the same anomalous readings, with the station consistently recording ideal growing conditions that bore no relationship to the actual environmental conditions observable in the field. Dr. Patricia Martinez, a plant ecologist with West Virginia University, became interested in the Dolly Sods weather anomaly when Chen presented his findings at a regional forestry conference in March of 1995. Martinez specialized in high-elevation plant communities and was familiar with the harsh environmental conditions that characterized the Dolly Sods ecosystem. Martinez visited the weather station site in May of 1995 to examine the vegetation communities in relation to the anomalous climate data. She found typical Dolly Sods plant species adapted to acidic soils, temperature extremes, and periodic drought conditions, with no evidence of the temperate species that should thrive in the microclimate conditions recorded by the monitoring equipment. The vegetation was exactly what you'd expect for a harsh mountain environment, Martinez observed in her field notes. But the weather station was recording conditions that would support completely different plant communities, species that require consistent moisture and moderate temperatures that don't occur naturally at that even elevation. Martinez collected soil samples from around the weather station to analyze the growing conditions and nutrient availability that might explain the discrepancy between recorded climate data and actual plant communities. Laboratory analysis revealed soil chemistry consistent with the harsh mountain environment, including high acidity and low nutrient levels, typical of Dolly Sods conditions. However, Martinez's soil samples also contained microscopic root systems and organic matter that appeared to come from plant species not present in the visible vegetation community. The root fragments showed characteristics of temperate forest species that required the precise temperature and humidity conditions recorded by the weather station, despite no above-ground evidence of such plants in the immediate area. Forest Service botanist Dr. Michael Rodriguez joined Martinez's investigation in August of 1995, bringing expertise in plant identification and soil analysis to examine the mysterious root systems found in the weather station soil samples. Rodriguez confirmed that the root fragments represented plant species that were not part of the documented Dolly Sods flora. We found root systems from species that don't grow anywhere in West Virginia, Rodriguez wrote in his research report. Some of the fragments appeared to come from tropical or subtropical plants that require year-round warm temperatures and high humidity. Others represented temperate species that need specific soil conditions that don't exist in the acidic, nutrient-poor environment of Dolly sods. Rodriguez also discovered that the mysterious root systems appeared to be actively growing and healthy, despite the absence of corresponding above-ground plant material. Microscopic analysis showed cellular activity consistent with living root tissue that was actively absorbing nutrients and moisture from the soil. The investigation expanded when additional soil samples collected at increasing distances from the weather station revealed a gradient effect in the mysterious root systems. Root fragments were most abundant directly around the monitoring equipment and became progressively less common at distances greater than 50 feet from the station, suggesting that the anomalous climate conditions were somehow localized to the immediate vicinity of the weather monitoring equipment. Dr. Sarah Chen, a climatologist with the National Weather Service, visited Dolly sods in October of 1995 to evaluate the weather station anomaly and determine whether the equipment might be providing inaccurate data that could affect regional weather forecasting. Chen brought calibrated reference instruments to compare with the automated station readings and verify the accuracy of the reported climate data. Chen's independent measurements confirmed that the weather station was accurately recording the anomalous temperature and humidity conditions, despite the readings being inconsistent with environmental conditions measured just a few hundred yards away. The localized microclimate appeared to be genuine rather than the result of equipment malfunction or calibration errors. The station was providing accurate measurements of an impossible microclimate, Chen noted in her technical evaluation. The temperature and humidity readings were precise and consistent, but they described environmental conditions that couldn't exist naturally at that location and elevation. Chen's investigation also revealed that the anomalous climate conditions showed daily and seasonal patterns that corresponded to optimal growing cycles for the plant species identified through root system analysis. The temperature and humidity variations followed schedules that would maximize growth rates and reproductive success for temperate and subtropical vegetation, despite no visible evidence of such plants in the area. The National Weather Service launched a comprehensive investigation of the Dolly sods weather station in January of 1996, concerned that the anomalous readings might indicate equipment problems that could affect the accuracy of regional climate monitoring networks. The investigation involved replacement of all monitoring equipment, soil analysis around the station site, and comparison with data from nearby weather monitoring locations. The federal investigation confirmed the presence of the anomalous microclimate conditions and the mysterious root systems in soil surrounding the weather station. However, investigators could not identify any natural or artificial factors that might account for the localized environmental conditions or the presence of plant root systems from species that were not part of the visible ecosystem. Dr. Linda Carter, the lead National Weather Service investigator, noted that the Dolly sods phenomenon challenged fundamental understanding of how microclimates develop and persist in mountain environments. The localized conditions appeared to be maintained by unknown mechanisms that operated independently of regional weather patterns and topographic influences. We documented environmental conditions that shouldn't be possible given the elevation, latitude, and regional climate patterns, Carter wrote in her investigation summary. The microclimate was too stable and too specific to be explained by normal meteorological processes. Something was creating and maintaining ideal growing conditions for plant species that don't exist in the visible ecosystem. The investigation also revealed that soil chemistry around the weather station was gradually changing to support the mysterious root systems, with pH levels and nutrient concentrations shifting toward conditions that would favor the unidentified plant species. The changes appeared to be occurring despite the continued presence of typical Dolly sods vegetation, that should maintain the area's naturally acidic, nutrient-poor soil conditions. The National Weather Service investigation was terminated in June of 1996 when Carter's research team was reassigned to other projects. The investigation files were classified and removed from public access, with subsequent inquiries about the Dolly Sods weather station referred to federal agencies that declined to comment on their findings. Local Forest Service personnel continued monitoring the weather station despite the end of federal investigation, noting that the anomalous climate readings persisted and the mysterious root systems continued to expand in the soil around the monitoring equipment. The vegetation community visible above ground remained typical of harsh mountain conditions, showing no evidence of the favorable microclimate conditions recorded by the weather station. Current Monongahela National Forest botanist Margaret Dotson estimates that the mysterious root systems now occupy soil areas extending approximately 100 feet from the original weather station location. Though no corresponding above-ground vegetation has ever been observed, the root fragments continue to show characteristics of healthy, actively growing plant tissue from species that require environmental conditions precisely matching the station's impossible climate readings. Today, the weather station continues recording ideal growing conditions for an invisible ecosystem that exists only below ground, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity levels for plants that flourish in soil but somehow never break the surface. The roots grow in earth that remembers a climate that exists 3 feet above ground, but nowhere else in the mountains of West Virginia.